Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and we've looked at many wondrous structures across the land and the realm, to include the state capital of Utah and the state capital of Pennsylvania. All these structures and the ground that we're flying over right now have tremendous architectural capacity and wondrous geometric precision. And yet in today's exploration, we're going to be focused on looking exactly at the structures that remain, the hard evidence of Tartaria that remains to this day, that you can go visit anywhere in the land.
Are you just a dream, Merlin? A dream to some, a nightmare to others!
We begin by looking at the National Palace in Barcelona, Spain, built 1926 to 1929. Yes, another one of these wondrous structures that was built for an international exposition, because what else would it be? And they managed to churn this one out in 3 short years in Spain in the 1920s, a very impressive accomplishment. When we look closer at the dome and the supporting towers, though, we see the very intricate detail, and this is certainly not a temporary structure, as it is still standing and you can still go visit it to this day. So, in those aspects, it seems to be very different, or an aberration from what we typically come across with these structures built for expositions, or exhibitions, or whatever we want to call them. The great World's Fairs, though, always seem to have a particular aesthetic, and you can see it in this image with the way that they're lighting behind the building. There's awfully something interesting about this image, although I'm not going to jump to any speculation about it, it's just intriguing. Looking at a more contemporary image, we can see that the building still retains its exhibition status, and no doubt it appears as though that's the way it's still used. You can see the details in the construction, and for some reason I'm reminded of the Union Station in Kansas City, and the way that building is now currently used as an exhibition hall, especially for the championship showcase of the Kansas City Chiefs. Looking on the interior, though, we can see that there are aspects of construction that indicate that this is permanent. Look at how well constructed this dome is with all the columns, and then the effort put in the artwork. And recall that this was all completed in 3 years for this international exposition. You know, it never ceases to amaze me how whenever we have an exposition we can pull off anything in a very short amount of time. Now, yes, it was the 1920s. Technology had come a long way from the 1800s, or so we're told. Even these columns we're looking at right now, they try to tell us that these are not actually full alleged columns, but these are merely visual columns, and that they're simply facades. Well, they're holding up quite well if that's the case. Yet on the interior, we see much more ornate and well-decorated columns, as though more effort were put in on the interior of the building. And oftentimes I question why it is that we tend to gloss over the interior of the building, whether it's the mainstream or some of us, when we get into the joy of looking at the exterior of all these great structures, we tend to overlook what's on the inside. Of course, on the outside of this particular structure, no attention to detail has been spared, as we can see the ornate, what will be told are carvings or formations. How exactly was this done in the 1920s? And certainly there must be somebody out there amongst the viewers who has a grandparent that was somehow involved in the construction of this, and by all means I invite you to comment. Let me know what the second or third hand account that you have from your grandparent who participated in the construction of this. And I am not being sarcastic, I would really like to hear this account, because this is quite a stunning piece of architecture, and we are lucky that we still have it, because most of these structures from World's Fairs, exhibitions, we're always told are temporary. Does this really look like this was ever meant to be a temporary structure? No, certainly not. And even more impressive that they could produce this in 3 years in Spain in the 1920s. And remember that the 1920s was that time frame between World War I and World War II, and it occurred right before the Great Depression, which afflicted the entire land. Some very intriguing artwork on the inside of this palace, and it is certainly well worth the title of palace. For whatever reason, I'm also reminded of the way that it compares with all the great state capitals that we've looked at across the United States. And yet this is in Spain, and this is something that they managed to produce in the 1920s. The interior is no less astounding, where you can see some of the arches and the columns and what we looked at with the decoration. And it also has a very impressive organ. Why exactly does it have an organ? Well, you know how I like to focus on what exactly the real explanation is behind the organs, and maybe they just wanted some interior music, or it was perhaps just a final touch. But when you look in closer at the detail on the interior, you can see that there was clearly a lot of effort put into constructing this incredible palace. It's been modernized today, of course, and we can see the touches of modernity that came about with what will be told is urban renewal. but you can still see the original construction that endures to this day. So perhaps that's the heartening story with this particular palace in Barcelona, is that it retains a lot of its natural charm. And I would certainly like to go examine this in person. And if you are in Spain, I certainly encourage you to see the structure in person, because there are a lot of unique intricacies in it that defy the simple explanation that this was truly completed in 3 years. I mean, maybe it was, but if we really were able to do something like this in 3 years, we've lost a lot of capability, haven't we? Spain is such an interesting place with many examples of varied architecture, and we can see many examples of the old world that still survive to this day in many of its great cities. However, there are also other signs that they have embraced the concept of urban renewal. Well, I guess everyone has the choice to do so. Let's move on and look at the Palace of Mafra, moving over to Portugal right next to Spain. And this was built 1717 to 1755, and I put the question mark behind it because we're going back in time, and yet for whatever reason it seems like we have even greater capability. Well, of course, they didn't bang this out in 3 years. It took well over 30, and so that will be the explanation for how they were able to do it. We're informed that King John V of Portugal, in a bout of piety, decided to build this wonderful palace, convent, basilica. We basically give it every title that we can. And looking at it, you can see why. It really is everything. It feels like it's one of the great capitals that we'd see in the United States. It feels like it's one of the great palaces in Europe. And then why not throw a convent in it as well? Because you need to have all these explanations for all these functions to actually have a legitimate background for this building. Otherwise, people might be asking questions that they shouldn't. And oddly enough, we see a combination of so many different architectural styles with this particular palace. And we have the 2 tall towers. We also have a very ornate dome with the portal windows, wondrous cupolas, and fine detail. But we have to look a little bit closer to really appreciate the intellectual and geometric genius that clearly went into the construction of this particular palace. Because when you look at it from the ground up, you can see the way that all the lines seem to intersect and run together. This is a fine precision example of wondrous construction that was done in the 1700s. Now, of course, the explanation for anything in Europe is that they have a longer history, and so they just simply managed to build wondrous palaces like this in the great cathedrals there over time. We even go so far as to say that we had a lot of examples of this great architecture that were actually transported to the United States, such as in Hearst Castle, and that's how we explain the wondrous structures in the United States that manage to match the wondrous structures in Europe, even though they have hundreds or thousands of years more of history in Europe, at least from the current civilization that exists there. Looking closer, though, you can see that this is another one of these structures that has different appearances depending on the light. And it really comes out when looking at the pediment and the columns and then these particular towers. And looking at these towers, I am reminded quite a bit of Hearst Castle. And yet this is a palace that far exceeds it, especially in size. Looking at some of the interior, what we'll be told are cloisters, or whatever you want to call them, with the many arches and the balcony. And then you can also see how the wall and the coloring on the construction material seems to alter a little bit. There's also one of those great rotunda turrets or towers there to the left. And I think that's what gives this structure so many unique appearances. We have some older imagery of it, indicating that it's always been there, but this is still a palace that you can go visit in Portugal today. And you certainly won't be disappointed, because just appreciating its aesthetic beauty and the geometric precision behind it, something that we just don't see for whatever reason with our modern steel and glass constructions. But once again, appreciating the very foundation and the roads that run around this wondrous palace are quite amazing. Again, recalling that this is the early 1700s when they started construction on this, and they didn't finish it until the mid-1700s or so, we're told. How exactly did they pull off all the detailing on these towers? And then, of course, you can see the front entryway with the raised stairs. Once again, this seems to give impressions of an almost science fiction appearance behind this palace, and I'm almost surprised that this palace hasn't appeared in any of the more prominent science fiction movies. I mean, just think, George Lucas could have used this palace as a practical example for the palace on Naboo, right? Okay, no more references to the prequels. But looking at it from every angle and every perspective, you can see that it's an impressive structure, whether you're looking at it from a great distance or up close and personal. And I think that's something that really gives us an indication that we're looking at an old world structure, because you can always see its beauty. It stands out on the landscape no matter how far away from it you are. Yet when you get closer and you look at the precision layout of many of the stones or bricks or whatever the exact composition, the material they used for constructing it, you get the impression of something that is far more advanced. I mean, are we to really just accept that they had armies of people? And yes, of course we are, because this was the king who ordered this in Portugal, and every effort of the nation went to constructing this impressive palace. The interior with the library, and yes, they have quite a fine library in this particular palace, is no less impressive. And you can see with some of the rotundas, the arches, and the domes that they just throw out everywhere on the interior. And of course, they're all well decorated, and we see many of the examples of impressive architecture that aren't even emulated today, let alone constructed on the scale that we're told was achieved back in the 1700s. And indeed, even looking at the ceiling here and seeing some of the wondrous detailings that go in the arches and the indentations and all the effort that they put into this. Now, of course, the explanation will be given is that it took several decades to complete this wondrous edifice. And because it was a project of the king, and it was because of a bout of piety, therefore all the effort that was put into it fully justifies it. Of course, there were many other structures that were being constructed simultaneous as to this one. And always when we look at it, yes, you can't have a library unless you have a very well-decorated balcony and many wondrous adornments. Otherwise, how are you actually going to know that it's a library? Indeed, looking at the impressive decorations on this library, it suddenly makes me feel that many of the great Carnegie libraries just aren't cutting the expectation that we have for standards. What exactly is going on here? Look at these wondrous displays with the beautiful figures on every single display, all to decorate a library. Now, of course, the explanation is it's because it's for religious purposes. Well, let's head over to India to look at the Palace of Winds. This was built in 1799. Now, the exact construction history on this particular palace seems to be a little bit less detailed, but yet the construction of this tremendous edifice seems to be far more detailed than we can possibly imagine. Now, we've looked at a few structures in India and Southeast Asia before, and once again we see the same detailings of geometric precision. And in this particular live footage looking at the exterior, we can see that we have a series of domes, and we have many domes that are actually integrated within the wall. Very advanced construction and wondrous capability that's being displayed here. Once again in the 1700s, albeit in the later 1700s, so perhaps they had some great advances in India and they were able to achieve building this palace during that particular time frame. Looking at different perspectives, though, you can see that for whatever reason, there do seem to be similarities in terms of the construction material and how they compare with the previous palaces that we looked at in Spain and Portugal, respectively. You can see that some of the towers in the very center aspect of this particular palace, or you can see that many of the details, though, are very apparent in this particular palace, and we have to wonder and consider what exact construction efforts were required to complete something like this. What were the actual details of planning and construction, and how exactly did they support it logistically? I know we're not supposed to ask questions about logistics, especially when we look at the interior. We see something quite otherworldly when we look at the interior of this Palace of Winds, where we have many different colored windows and different arches, and a series of arches underneath an arch. Wondrous decoration, and again, advanced construction capability that, once again, we do not try to replicate on a large scale to this day. And in fact, the only thing you'll see today is something done on a very small scale. Maybe a single display within a room. Now, perhaps you're thinking, you just need to go out and walk around and look a little bit harder. You need to look at one of those modern skyscrapers, and you'll see something like this. No, that is not the case. Skyscrapers are made out of a completely different material. There is nothing, and there is nowhere, and there is no one who is trying to build a structure like this today. Now, some people say that some of the modern temples or some of the modern churches that are being constructed might compare to this. And maybe so. But it seems to be that the comparison never matches up, especially when you look at it a little bit more closely. You get an idea of quality and endurance in these true bona fide old world structures that defies the imagination. There's also the fact that anything we try to construct to this day does not have this enduring property behind it. But I do have to wonder, what's the real story behind this structure? Is it what we're given, that it was something that was simply built in the late 1700s in India as yet another palace? Or is there a much more intricate story behind it? Is there aspects of its construction that completely exceed anything that we can begin to imagine? Whatever its origin story, it is a wonderful structure that you can still visit and interact with today, and you can prove that it's there physically. There's a lot of footage that shows all the wondrous details, and I would certainly recommend that if you have the means, or if you find yourself in India, or if you are in India, that you visit the structure and appreciate its full beauty. I'm truly impressed by all the domes and all the little towers that we have mixed with the arches. I think that's what gives this structure a very unique appearance. And oftentimes it's the structures that are unique and even stand out from the other wondrous structures. And there's no shortage of incredibly beautiful towers and palaces and other examples in India. And even with that, this structure still manages to stand out, which is one of the reasons why I selected it. Even looking at the many hallways and the alignment of the arches and the fine detail within the palace. And once again, though, there's all these little domes that they managed to construct within it as well. So something that seems extremely advanced and something that, once again, we don't really try to do anywhere at any point in time. And wherever you walk within the structure, you can't help but be overcome by the aesthetic beauty that you see. I'm still amazed at the coloring in a lot of the windows, and I think that's something else that we seem to miss in our contemporary era architecture, is that we don't have the wonderful coloring. We don't have these images that we're looking at right now that really are pleasing and relaxing to the mind. Typically what you'll get are a lot of hard right angles and a lot of shiny reflective glass, especially if you're walking in a modern city. Now, maybe you appreciate that, and if you do, that's completely okay. But I kind of miss the fact that we used to have this in our structures, although when exactly it happened in our chronology is certainly up for debate, because I find it a little difficult to believe that we managed to pull off all these structures within a short amount of time. Although the history of any particular area we supposedly have well documented, and just so long as you don't compare it histories, then you won't have any issue, you won't have any conflicts. Look at the little towers and domes right here next to the more detailed tower off to the right, and compare and contrast what you see. And what's the exact construction material that was used on this? Well, anywhere else across the land we'll be told it's some sort of limestone or sandstone, and we're oftentimes informed what our limitations of concrete are. And elsewhere, this isn't the Palace of Winds, but these are other examples within India of some of the incredible interiors that they have, and I just thought I would showcase them real quick, showing the advanced construction knowledge that they clearly possessed at some point in time. And the coloring behind this is just stupendous. And looking at the interior here, you can see that there are many different examples of not only advanced architecture, but also advanced decoration, because it seems as though this is something else that we don't really want to put the effort into. And of course, we have our usual array of reasons for why we don't put effort into construction architecture to this day. And usually that explanation is, it's just simply not economically viable to build in a manner like this. Indeed. I mean, why build in a beautiful manner of something that's going to endure for hundreds or thousands of years when you can just throw up something that's a lot more temporary, and also something that you can get a lot more contractors and have some wonderful subsidies on. Well, let's move on. And now we go to Illinois to look at the state capitol in Springfield, built 1868 to 1888. And this is one of the great state capitals that we haven't looked at closely on this particular channel yet. Quite an incredible state capitol that they have, and it should be noted that this is the 6th state capitol in Illinois. So much as Chicago has 7 city halls, the state of Illinois has 6 state capitals. Here's the first one that was originally in a small village in the middle of the Mississippi floodplain. Yes, this is where we're told the very first state capital of Illinois was built, and this is what it is, a very modest house that was eventually swallowed by the waters of the great Mississippi. Kaskaskia, if I'm pronouncing that properly. And originally we're told that Kaskaskia was a town of 7,000 people, but the Mississippi flooded, or it changed its course, there's conflicting accounts, and it flooded this entire town, or this little village. There's still a small village with some impressive structures there, and apparently that's where they decided to put the first state capital of Illinois. Very interesting that we have all these accounts of the initial settlement of the area, with both Iowa and Wisconsin having their temporary state capital in Burlington, yet another town that was on the Mississippi. You would think or expect that we'd have more development on the Mississippi, but then you have situations such as this with the massive flooding, and I suppose that makes sense. What exactly is going on? Is it simple natural flooding with the Mississippi, or is there some other reason behind it? Also keep in mind that we're right next to the New Madrid fault line, so perhaps there's other explanations for what's really going on here. In any event, that was the end of the first capital of Illinois, so they moved it to Vandalia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where they built another state capital in the 1830s. And of course, this is considered a modest one, and let's remember that not 30 years later, just north of Illinois in Jefferson, Wisconsin, they managed to build a high school that looked like a castle, but this was suitable for their state capital at the time. Ah, yes, Abraham Lincoln, and that's what you'll see whenever you go across Illinois because, well, a lot of people who reside or visit Chicago tend to overlook the fact that there's a state outside of Chicago, and it is dedicated to the land of Lincoln, and that's what you'll see on the license plate. Abraham Lincoln looks a little different, though, doesn't he, without his particular beard. And with this state capital, we can see that they have all the trimmings of the historical aspects dedicated to it, so we know that when we're looking at the state capital, we can appreciate the struggle that the pioneers went when they were colonizing this entire land that was untamed at the time and uncivilized. At least that's what the historical account will tell us. And then here's the fifth state capital once they moved it to Springfield, which is where the sixth and current state capital is. And once again, we can see that they've moved up a little bit more with the classic dome and cupola and some columns around it, and then a little couple pediments on either side of it. And that was the fifth one, and apparently this wasn't good enough either. So then in 1868, they needed to go all out and build a gigantic state capital. Keep in mind that while they were constructing this, 1868 to 1888, they were also building other state capitals, such as the Iowa state capital that we've looked at quite extensively. But let's also recall that they were building numerous courthouses in just about every single county. They were building wondrous churches and cathedrals. Ah, yes, there he is again, Abraham Lincoln in front of the current state capital. He just doesn't look the same without the beard. And let's be honest, it's just like Commander Riker on Star Trek. He had to grow the beard. He was a great person before, but then once he grew the beard, it gave him an exponentially awesome factor that could not be denied. The beard does it all. And indeed, it's kind of strange looking at reliefs or images or pictures or statues of Abraham Lincoln without the beard. I mean, the beard has just come to have been associated with his greatness, much in the same way it's associated with the greatness of Commander Riker. Looking on the interior, though, we see another wondrous palace, and just think about the earlier images that we looked at actual palaces in this exploration and compare and contrast with what we have here with the state capital in Illinois. Indeed, we even have pediments integrated into the walls, we have very well decorated columns, and we have many different types of marble. Looking up at the dome, we have another very well decorated dome. It's just incredible what they could achieve in the United States in the 1860s. And keep in mind that by 1868, they were already building their sixth state capital in Illinois. I got confused with Chicago because they got 7 city halls there. So again, all these wondrous administrative government buildings that they were all building within the period of a century. Of course, they haven't built another one since then because I guess they were finally satisfied with this incredible palace that they managed to pull off in 1868 to 1888. That's it. We don't need to build another one. I mean, you would think with the advances in technology and the increase in logistical capacity in the 1900s, somebody would have wanted to build another state capital, an even nicer one, maybe a gigantic skyscraper in Chicago. I don't actually have the capital of Illinois in Chicago. No, that's crazy talk. It's got to be somewhere close to the Mississippi because that's where it makes sense. Oddly enough, we do see some parallels, though, with the state capital in Iowa, and yet its own distinct, intricate flavor of beauty within the Illinois state capital. And this is definitely on my list for an on-site exploration, but for those of you who have the means, I strongly suggest you visit Springfield in Illinois and take a look at this wondrous state capital, because you can see that it has all the fine detailings that we would expect to find in the great palaces in Europe. Oh, look at that, nice little lamps and light posts on the inside of the structure. And again, a very large, cavernous appearance that we have on the inside. Vast amounts of cubic space, and I'd be willing to bet that much like the Iowa State Capitol, that the climate control within inside this wondrous structure is perfect. In other words, you can go in there during those harsh Midwest winters and feel perfectly comfortable where somehow the temperature is maintained at 70 degrees. I wonder exactly what their heating and cooling system is within this particular state capitol. I'm sure it's very comfortable. Love the chandeliers and the lighting because that's exactly what the wondrous politicians of any state need to do effective legislation. Look at the columns, though, around this particular statue, and then look at the floor as well. And again, you can see that we're not just in any sort of regular government building. This really gives the feel of a palace, and that's the reason why I tend to refer to these classic state capitals that were built in the 1800s to the early 1900s as palaces. Because how exactly do you describe these? This is exactly what they were throwing up in the United States in the late 1800s for government activities. And I know we go over it time and time again, but every time I come across a new one, it's the same series of questions that you have to ask. It's even more egregious in Illinois because of the fact that this is the 6th state capital that they decided to construct. And looking at the exterior, you can see that it has some wondrous decorative detailing on it with pediment and columns, and then of course the very tall dome that they have. Now granted, it doesn't have 5 domes like the Iowa State Capitol, but it does have some subsidiary domes that are around the pediment. So wondrous construction and a very beautiful palace. And indeed, this makes 4 palaces that we have that are close to each other in a very unique pattern in the Midwest. We have this one in Springfield, Illinois. We have the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. We have the state capitol in Des Moines, Iowa. And then we have the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota. Do yourself a favor and take a look at how they line up on a map. It's very interesting. Other aspects of the interior, though, we can see the same decoration with the chandeliers, and then of course we have to have a very decorated ceiling because that's just what you did. I mean, they had 20 years to build this building, although I guess that's showing how the technology kind of fell off a little bit. They weren't able to do it in 3. Wherever you are, whether you're in Texas and you look at the Texas State Capitol or you just go to your local county courthouse, you will find actual examples of the old world that you can interface with directly. And I strongly recommend it because there's an additional element of realism and understanding of what the old world is when you go and interface with the building. And we're fortunate to have many structures from the old world that are still standing today, such as St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And even though the new contemporary era is sneaking in, we still have these structures that we can appreciate. And of course, I think some of the finest examples that we've seen across the land include going back to St. Petersburg in Russia. So it doesn't really matter where you are, Spain, Portugal, Russia, India, the United States, you can find numerous examples of this impressive old world construction. And you can appreciate it, and you can interact with it directly. You don't need to rely on pictures, and you don't need to rely on second and third hand accounts. It's something that you can experience firsthand, and it's something that I strongly recommend, because that's the best way to really understand what we're living in. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but... I'm no sorcerer. But I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and I thought we'd come back and take a closer look at the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, the infrastructure and engineering achievement, a required waterway from Lake Erie to the Atlantic. What came first, though? Was it really the canal or the towns? History tells us the towns came first, and I suppose that makes sense that they had the cities of Buffalo, although it was a village at the time, and they needed to construct a canal to connect Lake Erie to Atlantic. The solution was to build a 363-mile canal, and build 36 locks and other supporting infrastructure to include aqueducts and diverting waterways, and as we know in the 1800s, this was not exactly a great difficulty. But it was a dream project that had been suggested in the 1700s according to the official history. And once the United States was a nascent nation, they even submitted the proposal to President Thomas Jefferson in the very start of the 1800s. Thomas Jefferson was not exactly a supporter of the project. He said, "You know, I'm something of an engineer myself, and I might be wanting a bagel with my coffee." And he said that the project of the Erie Canal was just outright lunacy, or just short of lunacy. In any event, he was not going to support it. So it was left to subsequent politicians, namely this individual, DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York, who bears more than a striking resemblance to actor Cliff DeYoung. I'm sure that's just another coincidence, as we have many in these explorations. And he became the real champion of the project of building a canal in New York at that time. And remember, the United States was a nascent nation, and this was just after the War of 1812. Well, he contracted this engineer, Benjamin Wright, civil engineer, who bears a bit of a resemblance to a Telosian in capabilities. I mean, he had to be able to build this canal, that is, having telekinesis. And we also have other amateur engineers who assisted with the project, such as this individual, Canvas White. Also, we're told he's the inventor of the wondrous Rossendale cement. And they managed to complete the canal in 8 short years, and it was all done by amateurs. Yes, all of these engineers and individuals who were responsible for building this canal, and all the engineering ingenuity that went along with it, they were not professional engineers. In fact, most of them practiced law. And I suppose that's the real explanation that we have from the 1800s is this is the United States, and it's the 1800s. You do not need professional experts. You have people on the ground who could suddenly become experts. Benjamin Wright, Canvas White, yes, those names rhyme, isn't that funny? They were the ones who could simply innovate all of these wondrous technological aspects to complete this canal. And keep in mind, when you build a canal, you're not just simply constructing a canal, you actually have to excavate it and dig it. And keep in mind that since the United States was not developed at this time, they also had to remove all the trees. Oh, and by the way, they had to cut this canal out of limestone and rock. And they managed to achieve this in 8 years. Now, we have supporters of the mainstream narrative who like to tell us that the Industrial Revolution had happened and that made this possible. Yes, the Industrial Revolution, although heavy machinery was not invented until 1890 and employed in engineering projects on a large scale until the early 1900s, and we saw the wondrous engineering projects that gave us. But the Erie Canal is impressive because they did this all with human and animal power and to a lesser extent hydraulic power. So they cut through the rock, they managed to cut a nice deep canal, they managed to build it 363 miles in 8 years. Oh, and by the way, they also managed to invent new methods of removing all the tree stumps when they pulled all the trees down in the forest so they could dig out this canal. And that was all done with animal power. And again, remember, and here's one of the images that you can see, this was done before the advent of heavy machinery. And, we have this nice sketched picture, this rendering, this drawing, and that's all we really need to answer all of our questions. I mean, if somebody could draw something, it must have happened, right? And you can see how convincing this is. Now, we also have another account that the canal was namely built by German stonemasons and Irish immigrants who came in and did a lot of the heavy labor. But we're also told that some of those wicked nativists that they had in the United States, even as early as the 1820s, attacked many of the workers. They also fell sick with fever and other issues, yet despite all these issues, being attacked viciously and physically and suffering from numerous sicknesses and ailments, they still managed to complete the canal in a very short amount of time. And it's certain to say that even with our wondrous technological capability today, could we build a canal like this in 8 years? Well, maybe we could. The answer always is now is we just need the money, but we have the distraction of safety standards and other technological distractions. We do have images that show us how they poured the water, the marriage of the waters as they called it, once the canal was complete, to show the fresh water and the salt water being mixed, and they now had their wonderful water highway. The other intriguing aspect is all the other different things that grew up on the Erie Canal once they suddenly had it. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that the Erie Canal was already there, but it's intriguing when you look at the development of the cities that are along the Erie Canal, such as Rochester, Syracuse, and others, and the fact that we already explored Buffalo earlier, as Buffalo is the terminus point of the Erie Canal, and we did take an initial look at it at that time. We also have impressive architecture and infrastructure that was established within the Erie Canal, such as these wondrous aqueducts. And we're told that they had to come up with a solution for the trouble of cement that was available at the time, setting in the water, as technologically they didn't have one. And this led to the great invention of the Rossendale cement, supposedly by an individual named Canvas White, who we looked at earlier, the amateur engineer who was really an assorted hanger-on and suddenly became a major supporter of the project. But you can see that a lot of this infrastructure still stands to this day, and it's very impressive. And none of this natural cement appears to be eroding, much like the current Portland cement that we prefer using in all of our architectural and engineering projects in the modern and advanced 21st century. But for various reasons, we're told that they stopped using the natural cement. So I guess Portland cement's just that much better. You can also see that there's no shortage of bridges over the Erie Canal, and we have many different songs and American cultural references to the use of the Erie Canal. The whole purpose behind the Erie Canal is it's what led to the rapid advancement and development of these communities. Of course, we also had a rapid advancement and development of many Midwestern communities that were far to the west of the Erie Canal, essentially the states of Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, and all the others that grew up very rapidly, and they didn't have a canal. Of course, the answer will be, but they had the Mississippi River. Okay, fine, so be it. But we can look at these lock systems and see that these were developed and built at a time by people who were amateur engineers. So really, that's all they needed at the start of the 1800s? You just need a bunch of amateur engineers and a very dedicated politician, and suddenly you can build a canal out of nothing. You can bring in a bunch of immigrant workers who speak varied languages and put them to work on the task, and they can do an expert job at it. Oh, and they can die from sicknesses and then be attacked by people who employ nativist standards. Now, we're not told that the No Name or Know Nothing Party, whatever you want to call it, at the time existed in the 1820s when they were building this very elaborate and difficult canal, and yet at the same time they're telling us that the same sentiment existed. So once again, it's quite intriguing how we have this existence of political parties in the United States. But whatever the actual explanation, we're told that they managed to build the canal in 8 years using all human, animal labor, and a little bit of hydraulic power. The other interesting things to consider is they just seem to be able to innovate technological solutions on the fly. And I always find it intriguing that whenever we have these difficult challenges when considering our official historical account, the answer tends to be is that we have polymaths who just seem to pop up. I mean, that's how they explain the entire Renaissance, is suddenly all these polymaths just came about, these people who were experts in everything, and they could do anything because they would apply themselves properly. I wasn't really joking earlier when I said that President Jefferson was something of an engineer himself. I mean, it seems that if you practiced law at this time, you could really do anything. And we do have some very intriguing schematics and sketches of both the locks and the Erie Canal itself. Although, when you consider this, is this really something that was a design from the ground up, or was this something that was merely a recording of what was already there? And then the real project was simply augmenting it and then pressing it back into service. What makes more sense given the timeline that we have? And what makes more sense given the respective skill set of the individuals that we have involved with this supposed project? Now, if you want to sit there and believe that a group of legal eagles from the early 1800s and politicians, and then a slew of people who had these varied skills of being polymaths were just able to innovate and pull this canal out of their unique imagination when one had not existed before, then you're welcome to go ahead and believe that. But you have to consider the logistical challenges of doing all this. And let's just be kind and generous. Let's say that the official historical account is correct. How exactly did they logistically support this large grouping of individuals and animals that they had working in this area? I mean, they certainly had to develop the ability to bring supplies to them. They didn't have the railroad at the time. And indeed, the official historical account tells us that it was actually the development of the railroad that began to supplant the Erie Canal as the main highway from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. We do have many of these images, though, that give us the impression that they used the canal for many transport purposes. And of course, we're told ad nauseum to this day that it's far cheaper to transport things over a waterway than even on rails, depending on the particular situation. But for whatever reason, the canal fell out of favor, but it's still managed and used by the good people of New York. Now, let's look at the other projects that we've examined. We've looked at a very unique and incredible dam built in Art Deco style in the middle of the desert in southwestern United States. We looked at an impressive national monument, Mount Rushmore, in South Dakota. And now we look at how isolated this particular canal was. And really think about all the engineering effort that went into this canal. They had to dig it, they had to go through varied terrain in New York State at the time, which would eventually be called the Empire State because of how connected it was. You know, it's very interesting for a nation that loves and cherishes democracy, and we certainly love to say that every day in the United States. We sure also love to bandy about the term empire. Empire this, empire that. I wonder why that is. In any event, given how well connected New York was, we're told that the Erie Canal is how the state grew up so quickly and why they had such large communities at the time. Although the Erie Canal would have nothing to do with the growth of New York City because that was right off the Atlantic, there's no shortage of commemoration projects that tell us just how important it was. And something else that's really intriguing is when you look at all the cities or towns or villages that are along the Erie Canal to this day, chart their development and how they came about, and take a look at their population counts. You might find something very interesting about certain towns and cities that might not exactly make a lot of sense if we're supposed to go off the historical account. I'm not here to tell you everything, I'm just here to point you in certain directions and allow you to do your own research and see if you can corroborate this account. And maybe it did happen exactly like this. I mean, we're told that Benjamin Wright tried to design other canals as well. Even though he was not officially a professional engineer, I guess he really got the knack of it though, once he had completed the Erie Canal. I mean, just think about it. If you could pull off a project like that, why would you want to waste time being a lawyer? You may as well switch to being a civil engineer and design and build more canals across the country. The other interesting aspect, though, is considering the nature of the United States in the early 1800s. The United States did not have a grand old time in the War of 1812. It was quite a struggle, and yet it's a conflict that's nearly as strange as the United States Civil War in terms of its account and great difficulties. We're told that the United States was unable to achieve many military successes in the War of 1812. And the reason I reference that is, at the same time, if they were thinking about innovating and building a canal where none had existed before, then why didn't they just simply clear the terrain? I mean, level the entire terrain. If they had hills that they couldn't get over, it would be a lot easier just to dig it out. We'll look at some of the cities on the Erie Canal, such as Rochester, New York, and we also think back to our examples of Rochester, Minnesota. I'm wondering if they have a plumber building equivalent here, and believe it or not, they actually do. It's very interesting, though, when we consider how many of these names tend to get recycled and reused across the United States, such as Rochester. And there are many older buildings in Rochester, in New York, that give us the impression that this community is much older than we might like to believe. Certainly there's no shortage of old world architecture, and you'll find some of the finest examples in all these cities and towns that are along the Erie Canal to this day. And indeed, when we explore Buffalo, New York, it's one of the most well-known examples. Rochester has its own very unique building that's quite similar to the Plummer building that we looked at in Minnesota. And this is the New York Times Square building. And these are the wings of progress on the top of it. Now, naturally, this is an Art Deco building, because what else would it be? And we're told that this particular Art Deco building had its cornerstone laid on the very day that the stock market crash in 1929 happened. Now, you might be thinking, well, shouldn't the building have been canceled? But of course not. There was no issue with completing this building by 1930, and it has a very unique design with it, with the wings of progress on top of it. This is definitely a building that I've tabbed for an on-site exploration, because I'd certainly like to see what on the interior survives. The initial look that I've gotten from some of the images shows that this is an Art Deco building that unfortunately has not fared well. But when you see some of the other surrounding buildings here in Rochester, New York, you can see that there's still the signs of old world architecture and a very different signature than we'd expect in a more modern American city in the middle of New York, or Main Street, USA. Something about this doesn't look Main Street, USA at all. The other interesting thing is we've looked at very unique Art Deco buildings that do seem to be associated with the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes region, especially Lake Erie. You might recall the Mohawk building that we looked at earlier with its very, very impressive action figure on the front of it that somebody decided to do at that time. Why is it we always have these Art Deco buildings, though, that always seem to have the same construction timeline? They're always done within a year or less. The longest ones are 2 years, but the average is 1 year. And they always seem to be constructed in the late 20s. Many of them were even told they started construction, such as this one in Rochester, with the Great Depression happening. And so is it really that old adage that all you need is an economic downturn and suddenly you can churn out the greatest buildings? Well, I guess since we're told that the economy is doing so well in the United States right now, we're not going to get any really nice and new buildings. Sorry, it's container revival style for you, and that's going to be the nicest house you can get. Looking a little closer, though, we do see some of the very intricate details that we've come to associate with Art Deco. Now think back to this whole account that we have of the Erie Canal. If this canal was already there, and these settlements were already there, which we have strong indications that that tends to be the case, then what does it really tell us about the previous civilization? That the Erie Canal really was one of its highways, and that they had a very different layout in terms of our civilization. Now, does that mean that they didn't have roads, or does it mean that they had something more advanced that they just happened to use the waterways with? Or perhaps the waterways were just simply an aesthetic for them, and they had other means of transporting things. Going to Syracuse, New York, we see no shortage of old world buildings off of the Erie Canal, and we can see some varied and beautiful designs along with it. Very interesting aspects, though, when we look at some of the towers and the clock towers and all the very well-developed architecture, and you'll find some very beautiful sights in Syracuse. And in other tangential explorations, we've looked at Syracuse in a variety of ways before. We've even looked initially at Syracuse University. Quite intriguing, though, that so many old world buildings managed to survive in one particular location. Now, if you're thinking about this and whatever our actual account was when Syracuse was discovered, because we're told that Syracuse grew up rather quickly. And a lot of it was based on the university, and of course it was based on the traffic of individuals coming through on the Erie Canal. That is something that does actually support the mainstream account, and I will say it when we do come across it. But I find it so intriguing that we have all these buildings that just seem to repeat all across the United States from the old world, such as our quote-unquote Flatiron building. I mean, you may as well have one of those here in Syracuse as well, but we've seen this type of building all over the place. So very intriguing. In fact, they even have one in China, but we're told it's because China likes to copy U.S. architecture. And then let's not forget Archibald Stadium at Syracuse University. Yes, our stadium that we looked at during our stadium's exploration that looked a bit like a castle. And of course, we posited many different possibilities for what stadiums originally were. And you can see no shortage of old world buildings around this particular stadium. Although it should be noted that Syracuse University is not free from the scourge of brutalist architecture, as we see here in what I'm told is a library. I'll be honest, I haven't actually been to Syracuse University and don't really have a strong inclination to be going back to universities for any on-site explorations anytime soon. I'll look at them, but for some reason, I seem to have difficulties. But here we have a nice Carnegie library. Yes, that's exactly what they'll tell us, and you can see looking at the building that this is indeed a Carnegie library, and you have all the nice trappings of a typical Carnegie library, the wonderful columns and the great towers, because how else are you going to know you're going into such a building? Some of the other architecture, though, that you look at across Syracuse is very intriguing, such as these buildings and then what they have, this monument, or exactly what you want to call this. And I intentionally didn't do the research on the monument because I just wanted to get my own impressions of it. And I think this is something, and on a more serious note, I'm going to get on the ground and look at all these cities on the Erie Canal because I'd very much like to assess the construction materials, especially with this account that we have of extensive uses of what we're told by the historical account is Rossendale cement. You know, before we decided to use the better and more creaky Portland cement or concrete or whatever you want to call it in subsequent years. Very interesting across the board though, and I like to assess exactly what the construction materials of these buildings, of the supporting infrastructure of the canal is, and every monument and even this church over here, and compare and contrast it with some of the other buildings that we have. That's always the nice thing when you have so many different old world buildings in one location, is it allows you to do a little bit better of analysis. Or you could be one of those people who supports the mainstream account and believe that you simply need technology to actually tell you what these buildings are constructed of. You don't need to make your own assessments, just have someone else or something else do the thinking for you. And really, you really don't have any reason to do anything. You can just sit there and accept everything as it's told to you. And if that's how you want to be, have at it. I, however, find it a little bit more intriguing to do these explorations and really consider exactly what we've been told, because there seems to be quite a significant mystery here with the Erie Canal. Not just with the canal itself, but also with all these cities and towns that have grown up along it, all this supporting infrastructure. It seems to me that we have a very strong example of numerous lines of evidence for wondrous constructions, whether it's part of Syracuse University, it's part of Rochester, New York, the other towns, the canal infrastructure, that give us clear indications of a previous civilization that was far more advanced and had far greater capabilities of construction than we have to this day. Now you can repeat and say that yes, if we were so inclined, we could do these buildings if we wanted to, but we have safety standards, we have distractions, and it just doesn't make sense. We need to build things that are more efficient now. And if you want to keep saying that, and if you want to keep thinking that, be my guest. But you're doing that when you have all this evidence that's right in front of you everywhere that you look. And of course, when you show these images to someone and you say, this is strange, they'll say, what's strange about this? And they'll be completely serious about it. And perhaps you just have to accept the fact that some people are very, very strongly indoctrinated with what they've been told. And as we know, what you've been told first tends to be the truth, no matter how much conflicting evidence that you tend to see. And that's one of the more difficult aspects of these explorations, is really accepting this. And here we have a wondrous observatory. This is supposedly the second oldest building on Syracuse University. And what exactly is this constructed out of? Some sort of advanced geopolymer? Well, what are your thoughts on this? So we're told that a number of technological innovations were required to complete the construction of the Erie Canal, and the one I want to focus on is the waterproof cement, as this is a very interesting exploration topic that alternative researchers come across a lot. The Romans had it, but then the world forgot how to make cement that could stand up to water. The secret was still a mystery when the Erie was being planned. And yet there's conflicting accounts on this, because we're told that in Great Britain they actually had the mixture for this cement, but then other accounts say no, they didn't. So make of it what you will. Builders had no idea where they would come up with this critical item to hold together stone locks and aqueducts, and you might recall the individual who came up with this was Canvas White. But here we have this account, this individual, Andrew Bartow, an educated farmer who lived along the route of the Erie Canal, began experiments with a type of limestone found near his home. Because, I guess being a farmer, he just didn't have enough to do to occupy his time, and he just took extra time to experiment to innovate the cement because he knew they'd need waterproof cement to build the Erie Canal. It all makes perfect sense to me. By heating it to just the right temperature, he was able to produce a cement that would retain its hardness underwater. Rossendale cement. Cement from the same vein was used to build the Brooklyn Bridge more than half a century later, called Ken Burns. But yet, when we look at this account of Andrew A. Bartow, and remember this individual is just a farmer, here's what we have. In 1820, a patent for water lime, a hydraulic cement necessary for building locks, was issued to Canvas White, and that there is the Rossendale cement. And yet, here we're told, however, letters and documents exist that prove that Andrew Bartow deserved the recognition for this important discovery. To avoid the costly and time-consuming task of importing hydraulic cement from Europe, so you see, conflicting account, they're saying they already had the hydraulic cement from Europe, but then in the other account they said, no, it needed to be innovated and invented again. Well, which is it? He examined the limestone, he came up with a different kind of limestone, and then get this, he took it to Professor James Hadley at the medical college. Well, wait a minute. So a doctor is now an expert in innovating concrete and cement? So if I invent a new fuel-efficient method for my car, I'm going to go talk to my dentist about it, and he's going to certify it, and then the work will be confirmed that it's now perfect for use in cars because dentists are experts? Oh, wait a minute. This is the early 1800s, where everybody's a polymath, and everybody can be an engineer and an inventor. And I like this. Bartow informed the canal engineer, Canvas White. Remember, Canvas White was an amateur engineer, and White paid him $2,000, applied for, and was granted the patent. Bartow was to have a quarter interest in the patent. Little money was made by either man because others began to sell the water lime without paying royalties. Oh, somebody always gets cheated. That's the real American story, isn't it? And finally, with Bartow, they say this. In addition to his knowledge of construction, farming, science, and education, he was sufficiently qualified in legal matters to serve as a master of chancery, his name appearing on many county documents of his day. So, once again, everybody was an expert in everything, and that's exactly how we explain the mighty achievements in the United States and New York of the Erie Canal. What are your thoughts? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but...
The impressive engineering achievement of the Panama Canal. The artificial waterway, 51 miles in length, that enables ships to rapidly traverse from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, or the Atlantic to the Pacific, depending which way you're going. This incredible engineering achievement enables ships to save immense time and distance in their travel. It's also comprised of a series of 6 locks, 3 locks that elevate the ship, and 3 locks that bring the ship back down to the level of whichever ocean they're proceeding to. What's the story behind this impressive Panama Canal? So the plan of the Panama Canal comes from 1534? Before we look into the official history of the Panama Canal, it should be important to note that the canal itself actually runs from northwest to southeast. And that seems counterintuitive, especially when we think of the Atlantic being on the east side and the Pacific being on the west side. But it really does run from northwest to southeast. And you might notice some of the terrain features here. You'll notice that Gaddon Lake here is actually an artificial lake. So a lot of engineering effort that went into the Panama Canal. And looking at what we're informed is satellite imagery, or aerial imagery, or however you want to think of it as, you can see that there is a diversification of unique terrain. And of course, Panama being jungle terrain primarily. It's also a very humid, very, very oppressive place if you're not used to humidity. Try going from Florida to there. So why would they construct the Panama Canal? Well, the main reason being is that ships trying to sail from the Pacific to the Atlantic or vice versa originally had to go around Cape Horn, the Strait of Magellan, Drake's Passage, the other names they have for it, and it has a reputation of being a very stormy area. It's very difficult to traverse if you're in a ship of any sort, and apparently this applies to modern shipping. Of course, the explanation for modern shipping will simply be it saves a lot of time and distance, and we can understand and appreciate that. And certainly back in the days of sailing ships, when speeds were limited and provisioning was limited and there were other considerations, why would they want to go all the way around Cape Horn? The other option was to go through the legendary Northwest Passage, which many ships had tried to navigate, yet they were constantly stopped by the ice. So apparently the freezing Arctic Ocean, or the various inlets depicted here, were a lot more difficult to traverse. Of course, there were other examples, such as the Franklin expedition, where they tried to traverse the Northwest Passage and they ended up stuck in the ice. And this was a very terrifying experience, and indeed, the name of the ship and the name of the series about it is called the Terror. What a coincidence. And if you try to traverse the Northwest Passage, you could suddenly find yourself beset by all sorts of problems. You could have some sort of horrifying terror bearer or apparition that's trying to kill you, and even the great leadership efforts of Professor Legasov or Brutus himself couldn't possibly save you from destruction, and you'll end up marching around the terrain until you all eventually perish of malnutrition and other causes. In any event, there were a lot of good reasons for establishing the Panama Canal, to not have to traverse either one of these shipping lanes as they were originally established. And we can see that there is a lot of complexity that went into the construction of the Panama Canal. There was a lot of difficulty. The construction of the locks, the creation of the artificial lake, which were all necessary. But originally this idea came from Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and also the leader of the Habsburg family, King of Spain. The reason that he directed this, we're told, is that because Spain wanted to reach its empire in Peru a little easier. And so having a shortcut instead of having to go around the southern tip of South America made sense. Interesting different images that we have of Charles V here. Nice suit of armor there. And I'm sure there's someone out there in the comments that's going to tell me the suit only weighed 2 pounds. And the reason we don't construct such things today is because these are based on esoteric knowledges that have been lost to how we could properly construct armor. Well, whatever the explanation, he does look pretty cool in it. There's also a rather odd variety of the images that we see and how Charles V was displayed or depicted, where, oddly enough, you could just simply say it's artistic license. And here's an image of him when he was younger, although does this really look like the same individual? I don't know. I mean, it may be. We're told that it is. And then you see some even more strange features in some of the period dress at the time. I almost have difficulty accepting this as a period photo, or should I say a period painting. But what's really the difference between a painting or a photo? I mean, it's not the real Charles V, it's a representation of him, whether it's a photo or a painting. Well, apparently the idea for a canal through the Isthmus of Panama was lost until this particular individual, an enlightened intellectual from 1600s Great Britain, or the Kingdom of England as it was then, suggested in his book. And he talked about what a great idea it would be to actually have a canal that would save a lot of travel time. Now, it's really odd, though, that this book that Mr. Brown wrote is considered a bit of an encyclopedia. And yes, here it is. Thomas Brown, Doctor of Cyclic, Truths, Tenets, commonly perfumed. I always love going Middle English. Who exactly wrote this? But then we see one of our favorite words, pseudodoxia, or pseudo-everything. And this is apparently a treatise on how people were not using their intellect well in the 1600s. The Kingdom of Scotland even attempted to establish a scheme called the Darien Gap, where they were going to actually use a land route to run supplies from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This business venture didn't work out, though, for various reasons, and this compelled the Kingdom of Scotland to join the Kingdom of England. And then we have Alejandro Malaspina, who was a Spanish officer who was directed to do a survey. And keep in mind, this is 200 years after Charles V's initial survey. So we have 200 years worth of planning this canal, but so far no action. So what exactly compelled people to take action? And who will actually build the canal? So initially we thought the Spanish were going to do it, then we thought maybe the English were going to do it. Then the Scottish tried doing a land route, but it didn't work out so well, and because of the economic hardship, they ended up having to join with the Kingdom of England. So I don't know, perhaps Edward the Longshanks should have tried the economic approach, who knows. But at this time in the 1800s, as we've gone through time, the United States had gold discovered in California, and therefore there was the need to rapidly move people, because they didn't have the Transcontinental Railroad at that time, from the East Coast to California, because there was gold there. And strangely enough, the United States got itself involved in Panama at that time, even though it really didn't have an initial stated interest, and they built a railroad in the 1850s that conveniently parallels where the eventual canal would be. What a coincidence. And we do have some images of it, although it should be noted that deconflicting which images are the construction of the railroad and the construction of the canal can be problematic. We're also informed that they had this little steam-powered excavator available at the time. And this is interesting because there's conflicting accounts about what availability they had on these steam-powered excavators, this being the Otis patented excavator. And initially these ran on tracks, but we're informed that in the later 1800s, they were able to convert these to tracked vehicles, so some of the first signs of mechanization. So really, what is the account of heavy machinery? Once again, it's a conflicting account. Did they really have it in the 1800s? Well, yes, but they didn't have what we consider traditional heavy machinery. And of course, we have this drawing of the construction of the railroad in Panama. Now, I can't really tell what's going on with some of these excavators. It looks like they're operating on the railroad here, so could this be a photo from the actual construction of the canal? Because as you'll find out, there were French involvements with the canal, and then there was the subsequent American involvement, or the United States, because we want to be very clear about who we're talking about when we refer to Americans. And oddly enough, you can see some unique elements to the terrain. And consider the weather patterns. Were the weather patterns in Panama the same today as they were back in the 1800s? Because we do have numerous reports of rather strange and bizarre weather patterns that occurred. So it's hard to say. It was really the French, though, who decided to get along with the project, and Ferdinand de Lesseps here from France, who was actually a diplomat and was instrumental to the construction and completion of the Suez Canal. We'll look at the Suez Canal later and see how it compares to the Panama Canal. But the French were able to pull off the Suez Canal, but they had some difficulties when it came to constructing the Panama Canal. And they were at it from official time frame 1881 to 1899. Again, some sources conflict, but that seems to be the generally agreed upon consensus between scholars and historians. And oddly enough, the French plan involved not using any series of locks, but trying to keep everything at the same sea level. And this was considered an engineering faux pas that was not necessarily going to work. And you might notice that in this little sketch or drawing or bird's eye view, which we'll see this frequently referred to as, there is no artificial lake here. So nobody thought about that. The French encountered great difficulty. They hadn't managed to overcome the problem with malaria and operating in a very difficult environment. Because let's be honest, if it is still like it is today, it is very humid down there. And if you're not acclimated to it, it's going to be very difficult to do heavy labor work. Although, again, here in this image we see it appears that they had heavy machinery of some sort. So what's really to be made of all this? And again, you can see the amount of effort that went into trying to construct this canal. Now, many different French investors pooled their resources to try to support the completion of the Panama Canal. And it was a failed project. Indeed, our good man Gustave Eiffel himself was invested in it. And there was an investigation, and many were held accountable for the fact that they considered it swindling of investors for all these years and all these lives that were lost in trying to construct this Panama Canal, with what we were informed later was a rather faulty plan. So the French just couldn't get the job done despite their best efforts. So what was going to become of the Panama Canal? How exactly was someone going to actually complete a canal? This is now the late 1800s, and again, according to the official history, we've had a plan or a survey for a canal for over 300 years. So what's going to be the solution? Who could possibly come in there with the ability to have the foresight to construct a canal with a series of locks, as that seems to be the way to go? And as if actually digging the canal wasn't complicated enough, also establishing an artificial lake by damming up the Chagres River. And thus enters the involvement of the United States and the Panama Canal becoming a United States project. It should be noted that Panama was originally part of Colombia. But Teddy Roosevelt, the great American president, remember Roosevelts are always affiliated with American policy successes, internal or external, intervened and they supported the Panama Breakaway Republic from Colombia. The United States assigned John Frank Stevens, who had built warehouses and shops and had also been responsible for the completion of the Great Northern Railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota, all the way out to Seattle. But they also had William C. Gorgas, who was the sanitation officer. It was very important to get that yellow fever or the malaria under control. And, of course, the United States apparently put a little bit more effort, at least so the official history says. But there were some difficulties with the actual plan that Franks had, and while he had prepared the infrastructure, it was actually George Washington Goethals, that's how the family says you pronounce that last name, who was brought in as the American military officer and West Point engineer from the Army Corps of Engineers that completed the project. And from 1904 to 1914, the United States finally pulled off the monumental Great Civil Engineering Project, which is considered one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. And we'll take a look at it at the end. And it involved a lot of different details, such as constructing the Great Locks and actually damming up the Chagres River to establish Gatun Lake. In any event, the engineering efforts are quite impressive, and we have no shortage of bird's eye views of the Panama Canal. It's very interesting because this one is purported to be from 1912, and interesting the amount of detail that they already had. It's almost as though they knew exactly what they wanted to do when it came into executing the project of the Panama Canal. None of this was fortuitous. They already had the Panama Railroad, which the United States had constructed, and then didn't seem to care that the French were suddenly involved in Panama, even though during that same time frame the United States was quite hesitant and reluctant and resisted the French efforts to intervene in Mexico. So, very intriguing set of conflicting foreign policies, but nothing really odd about that. That continues to this day. And perhaps it was simply a target of opportunity, if you will, that the United States could finally get its hands on completing the Panama Canal project and have total control over it. The bird's eye views are interesting, though, because they give you an idea of what the canal really had to traverse. Now, granted, it's only 51 miles, but the United States had completed the mighty Erie Canal project. And we'll compare the Erie Canal with the Panama Canal, and we should remember that the locks for the Erie Canal were for boats that were much smaller than the great ocean-going ships that were designed to traverse the Panama Canal. But let's take a closer look at some of these construction efforts. And here we can see the construction of some of the locks, at least an image of the lock already completed, and perhaps they're just doing some final painting or detailing. I can't really say from this image, but it's always interesting how when we look for construction photos, they seem to be very keen to get the construction photos once the main infrastructure or buildings are already completed. And it's also another interesting detail to compare and contrast some of the equipment that they had, because were they using these small excavators that could only travel on tracks or had rudimentary tracks established on them, such as this particular excavator, to complete all this digging? That was the other odd thing about the engineer John Franks, who had come down there. And he said that digging would happen on its own. He needed to establish the infrastructure. Well, he departed the project because he had no experience building canals, but General Goethals did have experience building one canal, at least, in the United States prior to the Panama Canal project. But looking at some of the equipment and some of the scale of it, it's an intriguing detail to really ponder at what sort of heavy equipment they had available, both at the end of the 1800s and then in the early 1900s. And here in this image, we can see that there seems to be much larger scale equipment available. And we could certainly say that was the early 1900s, and the official historical account does corroborate that fact with the fact that there was heavy scale equipment that was being developed at that time. Although how proficient would they be with it? Well, don't worry about it, because when you have a name like George Washington Goethals, there is no way that your engineering project is ever going to fail. And we can see that there are postcards and other very wondrous images of artwork that also go along with the images that show us all the effort and true infrastructure that went into completing these locks. Here as we look from the lighthouse in Gatun. And of course, if you really want a project to succeed, in addition to having a name such as George Washington Goethals, you can even have the President of the United States himself personally supervising the project, as here we have an image of Teddy Roosevelt. Although, oddly enough, this particular individual just doesn't really seem to be too happy to be there. I don't know, maybe he didn't get his medal for participating in the Panama Canal for really being there. And yes, they did award a medal, and then a bar for every 2 years you were there. And then here we have the image of Teddy himself. And remember that whenever the Roosevelts are involved, whether it's domestic or foreign policy for the United States, it is always going to be successful. If there's a failure, it's because a subordinate failed. But not in this particular case. And in all these images that we see of the immense construction efforts in the Panama Canal, we also consider the labor force. Now, official historical accounts tell us that they compiled a labor force from many natives, many locals to Panama, and then of course they brought in other individuals from the Caribbean. It was really a multinational, multi-ethnic workforce, and the United States had provided for their proper logistical support and, of course, guarded against the outbreak of malaria, and this is what enabled them to complete the canal. It's also attributed to the fact that it had a sound engineering plan, which is interesting to me because the French had pulled off the Suez Canal, and yet they had struggles with pulling off the Panama Canal because they wanted to keep it at the same level. But the United States designed the lock plan, or so we're informed. And it was by having this series of locks and then, of course, forming an artificial lake, because apparently these were all very easy things to do in the early 1900s. Now, of course, we don't attribute this to being easy. We say this is one of the greatest engineering achievements, some people in the history of the land. Now, I guess it's up to you to decide what kind of engineering achievement this really is, and it is very impressive. We also look at the imagery that we have of Panama City going out to the Pacific, and we see that it's a very impressive and well built out city with many impressive structures in it at the time. Of course, that makes sense because it's been settled for hundreds of years, so they had plenty of time to build these very impressive structures. But many of the images that we see are intriguing because they also give us an insight to some of the other details that may or may not have been going on at that time. Now, General Goethals, we said, had experience with canals, although was this experience in terms of building canals? And I'm not suggesting anything here, I'm just doing an intellectual exercise. What if he actually had experience in finding old canals and repairing them or bringing them to a state of working condition? I'm not suggesting that's what the photos are showing us. I'm merely stating to think about that. Imagine if this wondrous engineer, West Point graduate, who is certainly of the competent West Point graduates, because if you remember in our explorations of the Civil War, the competency spectrum varies wildly for American West Point graduates, especially those that served with the Union. I mean, imagine if you had Ambrose Burnside responsible for this project. They'd probably still be trying to dig it right now. But don't worry, Burnside would still retain his position because, you fail upwards apparently in the Union Army in the Civil War. But enough of that. Looking at some of these details, though, we can see that there was a lot of extensive effort that went into this. But I don't know if you see any issues with the detailing in these images. We can see that there was a lot of effort and that it took a long time, 10 years. And you might recall that they stated that there was a Panama Service Medal for U.S. citizens that participated in this construction. So it seems that there was an account that Americans had come down to participate in this project, and they were given a medal. And then for every 2 years, they were given a bar as part of their medal. So I guess you could show off that really cool medal. It just happened to have the face of Teddy Roosevelt on it. And why wouldn't you want to have a face of a Roosevelt on your medal? You could go home and show that off. I mean, who would want something like a certificate or a bond, such as the veterans of World War I got, that they could redeem much later after the war, like 1945. So I guess they weren't factoring in inflation or any of those other things. But some of the other earlier images of the Panama Canal give us an idea of what was really required to construct it. And was it really as difficult as they said? Or was there a lot of infrastructure already there? Because the French were there before the Americans. But, why don't you complete this administration building? I mean, you're going to all this effort to build all these impressive locks and dig out all this terrain. You may as well build a very impressive administration building. And it should be noted that Panama does actually have control of the Panama Canal, although it was a contentious political topic running all the way through the end of the 1970s when the United States agreed to hand over control to Panama. Although, oddly enough, the United States would continue to intervene in Panamanian affairs, such as Operation Just Cause, Operation Just Cause in the late 1980s. Indeed, a lot of the impressive and dramatic images of the early uses of the Panama Canal don't show commercial shipping, but the great warships of the United States Navy crossing through the Panama Canal. Here we have an early U.S. battleship with the old caged mast system. And then, of course, we have the more modern and current, although often retired battleship design, the USS Missouri of the Iowa-class battleships, considered the widest beam ship to actually pass through the canal. And indeed, it seems like they barely had inches on either side of this impressive battleship to get it through the Panama Canal. But it did actually pass through there. So what exactly is the Panama Canal about today? We have accounts that since Panama now has control over this canal, that they are continuing to expand it, and we would expect that with modern technological implements and a modern logistics system, it would be a little bit easier to expand the canal. Of course, you think about the size of the ships, and we think about some of the other areas where large ocean-going ships have to pass through: the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, other various straits. And we can see that there is a limitation for the length and the beam and the draft, in other words, how deep in the water a ship runs. And now they've managed to expand the Panama Canal, the Panamax ships that they cross through there. So it all started from a very simple idea and survey suggested by Charles V in the 1530s. And then finally, by 1914, they had a canal that was established there. Originally constructed under American supervision, with workers from all over, and now controlled by Panama to expand it. But looking at the early images, I'm still surprised by how often we see things that already seem to be completed. And indeed, when you have this account that multiple nations were working on this for decades, it becomes a little more difficult to establish and discern exactly where the images are from. Were the images from the railroad construction? Were the images from the damming effort to create the artificial lake, so then the water could be supplied to the locks? There's so many different questions and so many conflicting accounts. There's also numerous national powers that were involved with this Panama Canal creation. Why is it canals are so impressive, and how many actual canals do we have across the land? Here we have a photo, or a colorized photo, if you will, of some of the labor force, and we're informed that these were Spanish workers that helped the United States finally complete the Panama Canal from 1904 to 1914. I wonder if they got the medal. Probably not if they weren't American citizens. But looking at the United States with its defense spending, the United States clearly had a strategic interest in maintaining control of the Panama Canal. Indeed, during World War II, we're informed that the fact that they had the Panama Canal enabled the United States to operate a one-ocean navy, despite having responsibilities in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And indeed, of course, we look at the spending. The United States spends by far and away far more than any of its near competitor nations on its military. It's interesting when you also think about the deal of the century they got with actually building the most impressive engineering achievement in the modern world. Of course, we look at American spending on the military to this day and compare it to near nations such as Russia and China. Speaking of China, this is the panoramic view of the Nicaragua Canal. And this is from the 1800s in some time frame, and oddly enough, we have this panoramic view which shows a canal that passes all the way through Nicaragua. And we bring up China because right now China apparently has a plan to establish their own canal through Nicaragua, although it's only in the planning phase right now. We have to ask the question though, is it possible that there was a survey in Nicaragua? Official historical sources say there was, and why is this bird's eye view available that does show a canal that goes all the way through Nicaragua? Very intriguing. And of course, we have to consider, compare, and contrast the military forces, the Navy of China, the PLAN, and their conversion of aircraft carriers. Although China only has 3 aircraft carriers currently, or 2, depending on what sources you consult with, compared to the many carrier strike groups that the United States Navy has. And of course, certain filmmakers will tell you that China has an inevitable and infinite ability to rapidly build ships, such as in that odious, redundant disaster movie from filmmaker Roland Emmerich, 2012, where it was only the Chinese that could build the mighty arcs in time before the world flooded. Spoilers. Well, let's compare and contrast some of these canals. As stated earlier, we said that the Panama Canal is one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, at least according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And oddly enough, looking at this list, and of course, as you may have guessed, it's inspired by the earlier 7 wonders of the ancient world, or however you want to say it, the old world, we notice that a lot of these wonders are actually possible old world structures themselves. We definitely question the Empire State Building. The Golden Gate Bridge is somewhat questionable. And then, of course, we have the Panama Canal. And they do indicate here that its original construction was started by the French. I'm kind of surprised they don't wrap in the construction of that railroad the United States did in the 1850s, because that was rather critical to it. So, one of the new 7 wonders, or 7 wonders of the modern world, because it was a very difficult engineering achievement. But let's look at some of the other canals. And we start by looking at the Panama Canal itself. Its length, 82 kilometers or 51 miles, width, 150 meters, and depth, 12 meters. Indeed, the Panama Canal is very impressive because of the series of locks, and it also has a series of locks so you can get multiple ocean-going ships through there at the same time. So very impressive and very difficult. And then we look at the Suez Canal, just for comparison, and its length 193 kilometers, and its width it's actually wider, although the depth is deeper as well. And we look at the Suez Canal, one of the most important canals in the world. Construction of the grandiose structure, which began in the spring of 1859, took a whole decade and required the use of labor and about 1.5 million people. So again, we just had more people there. Over the years of its existence, the Suez Canal managed to be under the rule of France, England, joint control of the two countries in 1956 until it was nationalized by the Egyptian government and the so-called Suez Canal crisis, where the United States basically said that if England and France weren't going to consult with them, then they were going to be hung out to dry. Yes, that's that special relationship showing itself again. Now, how does the Panama Canal compare to something such as the Erie Canal? And I thought the Erie Canal would be a good comparison with the Panama Canal because it was done almost 100 years earlier. Really about 90 roundabout number, but remember that the Erie Canal was completed at a time when the United States definitely didn't have heavy machinery, and it didn't have a railroad system that was going right through New York. And you might remember our exploration on the Erie Canal, and notice that it is much longer than the Panama Canal, 540 kilometers, or well over 300 miles, as opposed to the 50 miles of the Panama Canal. Now, again, to be fair to the Panama Canal, it is for ocean-going ships. The Erie Canal was only constructed for basic boats to get to the Great Lakes and then back to the Atlantic Ocean. But there's many more locks in the Erie Canal, 35 locks, and there's a lot of details to it that seem to defy the construction methods available at the time. There's also the fact that they managed to complete the Erie Canal in under 10 years, prior to the advent of heavy machinery. But of course, the explanation is the same as the Suez Canal. They simply had the will and the workers to do it. And if people just work hard, they can accomplish any sort of engineering feats. Unlike the present, where we're constantly informed that if you want to save money, then you just save money and you build things cheap. And this is the reason given for why the United States, supposedly the most wealthy nation in the land, has difficulty maintaining its infrastructure. But what do you think? Do you think these canals were originally there? That they were simply found and repaired? Or that they really were constructed? And I'll attach this link in the description of the video. Look at the other canals and compare and contrast them. And let me know what you think. Were there canals that our current civilization constructed as we're told? Or is there a little bit more of a complicated story? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the Hoover Dam. The exploration of the Hoover Dam is going to complete our initial look at the so-called Great American Monuments or Structures. We looked at the Statue of Liberty in the east, we looked at Mount Rushmore in the Midwest, or the West, depending on your perspective, and now we're going to look at the Hoover Dam in the west, or vicinity of the Mojave Desert, near Las Vegas. The Hoover Dam warrants our attention because of its construction timeline. We're going to look at specific details about it, but initially we're just going to take the glance of the Hoover Dam that many people do when they're on tourism in Nevada. When you look at the Hoover Dam, you see that this is a very impressive structure. Would you be surprised to know, though, that the Hoover Dam is actually considered an Art Deco construction? Of course, the other aspect about it is that it was built during the Great Depression, and right now we're simply relaying what is generally well known about the dam. We're also told that because of its tremendous power supply capabilities, it supplies power to Nevada, Arizona, but primarily California, which takes the majority of its power. It depends on what source you look at, and you'll get different accounts in terms of its actual power supply percentages to the states. Yes, no one ever would have thought that it would supply the great state of California, where they decided, so we're told, to build a city in the middle of a desert, that being Los Angeles. As we know, the Los Angeles basin is quite an arid area. Looking at some of the images, though, of the exterior and the interior, we see a tremendously impressive edifice. And indeed, the dam, and I'll try to resist the urge to make dam puns, so much for that. But the dam was designed to provide power, we're told, and it was built during the Great Depression. Yes, another tremendous construction achievement during the Great Depression, because as we know, the United States government, at least, still had unlimited financial resources to conduct whatever projects that it needed to conduct. And for many people, this is the simple explanation for why many of these wondrous edifices were completed on rather short timelines and during the Great Depression. It also explains why the United States was able to quickly shift its focus from the Great Depression to the industrialization of the Second World War by becoming the quote-unquote arsenal for democracy. Many of these images, though, show a very romantic, arid landscape, which the dam fills. And you can see that the bypass bridge that we started the video on gives you an idea of how easily you could miss this very impressive structure. Much as with many of the interstates would allow you to miss other wondrous old world structures such as the Iowa State Capitol or the Cathedral or Basilica in St. Paul and Minneapolis respectively, because you're speeding along on the highway and you don't bother to look right to actually see the dam, or left depending on which way you're going. I always found Lake Mead and the surrounding area in Nevada very impressive, though, because it seems to have more indications with its existence. The dam is extremely unique because of the fact that when it was completed, we're told it was one of the largest dams in the world, and we'll look at the official account after we look at these exterior images. But what are your thoughts when you glance on these exterior images of this Art Deco masterpiece from the 1930s? Yes, a dam that was constructed to be an Art Deco masterpiece. And here I show the different lighting on the dam, and when you consider how the sunlight changes and then you compare that with the artificial lighting that's provided, what kind of visuals does it give you of this impressive structure? And looking at the overall structure of the dam itself, and of course we all are told that this was all constructed with poured concrete, and we'll take a look at construction photos in a moment. It's very easy to realize, though, that this dam did cost many lives, and whether it was something that was constructed exactly as we're told, or it was something that may have had a little bit more to it than what we realize. And oddly enough, we'll even see that in the official account, which raises questions. It's an impressive structure, and the terrain is rather beautiful around it, at least when you're looking at it, although when you're actually there in Nevada or in the Mojave Desert, you can't help but notice how unrealistically dry it is. It's as though you're standing under a hot air dryer at all times. I'm always amazed at the ability that we had, or at least we're informed that we had, to lay out such a structure like this. And remember, it's not just the exterior, it's always the interior. And especially when we come to Art Deco buildings, we tend to get an idea of the size and immensity, but then also the fine detailing that went into constructing such an interior. And while the Art Deco aspects of the dam may not be readily visible just looking at the exterior, aside from some of the towers that we see that are in the reservoir area, when you look in the interior of the dam, it actually provides many different touches of Art Deco. So quite an intriguing structure overall. Intriguing in terms of its construction timeline, the wonderful visuals that you look at. And there's a reason I'm doing this video a little bit differently, because I believe to fully appreciate this particular structure, you have to see it in live action. And it will certainly give a comparison in terms of how large, and give you an idea with the scale in terms of some of the other structures that we've looked at. It'll also make the official figures bounce out a little bit more. This is the bypass that they built, so you could just simply drive right past the dam without really looking at it. And of course, we're told that this is for security reasons. And indeed, it's also for security reasons that there are many areas of the dam that you can't access to this day, where you can see some of the Art Deco images that we will share later. Although, fortunately, we still have photographs, purportedly from within the dam, that will show this. Interestingly enough, this dam, we're told, was a long-term construction project, although actually pulling off the final construction of it didn't take long as you might think. There's always many different challenges that we don't realize when it comes to building a dam, and you consider what an engineering marvel that this is. The other thing I find surprising, look at that, U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Reclamation. Bureau of Reclamation? We have so many bureaus in our wonderful United States government. What a name, though. Bureau of Reclamation. What exactly are they reclaiming? Is it natural resources? Is it energy? Or is it something else? The dam has appeared in many other fictional accounts as well, even in that, well, less than stellar Transformers movie from the 2000s, where we're told that the dam was built to house the Allspark. Yes, it's very sad that I actually know that without referencing it. I myself prefer the original animated Transformers movie from the mid-1980s, but I'm sure you'll find that is no surprise. Back to the Hoover Dam, though, you can see it in different visuals just how complex the layout of it was. What kind of structural detailing and preparation of the terrain did they have to do? How much digging and excavation needed to be completed before they could actually begin to pour concrete, according to the official account? And what exactly was the whole purpose behind it? Of course, we'll be told that during the Great Depression they needed to provide jobs, and that seems sensible enough on the surface, but why exactly were they not building dams in every state? We certainly had rivers in every state. Why is it they didn't find any good dam site in every state across the Union and simply construct a dam? Imagine how many jobs you would have created, and we're also told that the Hoover Dam has paid for itself over time, so you could achieve that in other states as well. Let's take a look at what our friends at the Bureau of Reclamation tell us about the Hoover Dam and the official facts that we have. Again, such an interesting name, Bureau of Reclamation. You think they'd call it the Bureau of Dams or something like that. So the Hoover Dam, where is it? Black Canyon, spinning the Colorado River between Arizona and Nevada. And yes, I say spinning rather than spanning because it does seem to be spinning. About 30 miles southeast of Las Vegas, Nevada. How tall is it? 726 feet from foundation rock to the roadway. The towers and ornaments on the parapet rise 40 feet above the crest. Amazing that they know exactly how much it weighs. 6,600,000 tons. What kind of dam is it? A concrete arch gravity type. Very intriguing. Also, they don't mention that it's an Art Deco styling, but we'll see that in a little bit. What's the maximum water pressure at the base of the dam? 45,000 pounds per square foot. Very impressive. I'm always reminded of the transparent aluminum that they used in Star Trek IV to solve the problem of building a whale tank on the captured Klingon bird of prey. Yes, I slipped in a Star Trek reference. How much concrete is in the dam? 3.25 million cubic yards. Now here's where it gets intriguing. The first concrete for the dam was placed June 6, 1933, and the last on May 29, 1935. So really not all that long to construct it, just shy of 2 years. Approximately 160,000 cubic yards of concrete were placed in the dam per month. Very impressive achievement. How much cement was required? Now here's where it gets really interesting. More than 5 million barrels. The daily demand during construction of the dam was from 7,500 to 10,800 barrels. Reclamation had used only 5,862,000 barrels in its 27 years of construction activity preceding June 30th, 1932. Wait a minute. What exactly are they saying here? That there was construction that was going on prior to 1932? I mean, that's what this sentence seems to indicate to me. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. And I'm willing to accept second and third hand sources of information for this particular exploration. If you have a grandfather or relative who worked on this dam, let me know. Well, it's really the story behind this. Reclamation had used only 5 million barrels in the 27 years of construction activity preceding June 30th, 1932. Once again, it seems like we have a conflicting account here. What was an unusual feature of the Hoover Dam's construction? The dam was built in vertical columns of blocks, and we see an image of it over here, that varied in size from about 60 feet square at the upstream face of the dam to about 25 feet square at the downstream face. An estimated 215 blocks make up the dam. So very impressive, and yet in most of the images we have many other questions that we would ask. What were the principal items of work? More than 5,500,000 cubic yards of material were excavated, and another 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock filled placed. By feature, this included excavation. So we have 1.5 million cubic yards for the diversion tunnels. For the foundation of the dam, 1.7 million cubic yards. For spillways and incline tunnels, 750,000 cubic yards. So we're moving a lot of dirt here. Well, perhaps they just should have called the good people of Seattle, since they had a lot of experience with regrading and moving hills, and the good people of Boston, who were able to do it long before heavy machinery was even invented. What were the qualities of principal materials used in the dam? The principal materials, we have reinforcement steel, 45 million pounds, gates and valves, 21 million pounds, plate steel and outlet pipes, 88 million pounds. Just throwing these numbers about of this infinite amount of material as though it was really no issue, and perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps during the Great Depression, they had great logistical planning. They just had some rather questionable aspects about how they documented this, especially in the fact that we have no chronological record of photos. What construction work was necessary before operations started at the dam site? Again, they constructed Boulder City to house both government and contractor employees. Well, why not? You need to build a city before you can build a dam, and you can go to Boulder City to this day. They've got a really nice breakfast cafe there. Construction of 7 miles of 22-foot wide asphalt surfaced highway. So build a city, build a highway. Easy. Construction of a 222-mile-long power transmission line from San Bernardino, California, which it should be noted, Southern California is the main target of the power that this dam produces, to the dam site to supply energy for construction, and then ultimately to supply energy to Southern California. That still needs it to this day, At least that's what we're told officially. Well, let's take a look at some of the images that we have of the dam construction in the interior. The images that we see show a very tremendous and impressive layout with a large volume of space, and indeed this does conform with the report that we had with the amount of excavated material. Yet these images paint many different pictures and perceptions that we could have of the construction of this very impressive edifice. Now, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that many lives were lost in either the construction or perhaps the reestablishment of this particular dam. Or perhaps I should use the word reclamation. Why, again, is it the Bureau of Reclamation? And isn't it intriguing that we even have a Bureau of Reclamation? I mean, if it's supposed to be about the conservation of natural resources, call it the Bureau of Conservation of Natural Resources. It's also odd to me that once again we don't have a very well chronologically ordered account of the construction of this impressive edifice. Once again, we're to believe that we had the ability to plan out and execute the construction of this very complicated dam, and yet for whatever reason we could not properly organize a true well-documented account where we have images, video, and everything that's in chronological order. I mean, I can certainly say that one of my favorite examples, the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines, Iowa, can actually find time-lapse video that shows it being constructed over 2 years. I also saw it, so it's not to say that I don't believe that we could have constructed this particular edifice. I just find the account very problematic. And maybe we could just say that's because of limitations in the records, or it goes down to that old conflicted account that, yes, we don't want to disrespect our ancestors in the past because they could achieve these great things. They just didn't document them very well. You know, we hadn't figured out the internet yet. We didn't have the ability to store and archive records. We had them moved from one building to the next, and then, of course, those buildings tended to burn down for various reasons unknown, or somebody dropping a cigarette or being irresponsible in the basement of said building. We do see in the images, though, some of the heavy equipment that was used in the construction, reclamation of the dam, as we'll say. And it does give us clues, though, that there was a lot of effort that was put into this. And as I said, I had no doubt that there were lives that were lost in this effort. Now, I'm certainly welcoming any of you to share the information that you have about the Hoover Dam in the comments. Once again, it's another project that occurred during the Great Depression. And of course, the governments always have money no matter what the economic situation is. And of course, that's never questionable because, as we know, in most of the government establishment charters across the land, they have the ability to simply create finances or supposedly direct them. Now, we're not going to get into a complicated assessment of money. We're simply talking about the proposed difficulty of the financial situation. We're also told that this dam was a long considered project in the state of Nevada. And yet at the same time, they decide to actually execute it. And by the way, they built this during the same time frame that they were building Mount Rushmore in South Dakota during a time of greatest economic hardship in the nation's history. Indeed, this image here shows us how they supposedly poured the concrete in these large cavern areas or these large blocks that they built with framework. Isn't it interesting, though, how that always seems to be the account? They build these large blocks, they frame them, and then they pour the concrete in them. I'm not questioning that. I'm merely saying that seems to be a very well-known and used technique of construction. And it does make a lot of sense from many different perspectives. Do you see any issues with some of the images that we're looking at? Is there anything questionable, or does it seem to line up? Again, the biggest point of concern that I have is just the fact that we don't have a nice, well-ordered chronological account. Perhaps there's one out there. I was almost expecting to see on the Bureau of Reclamation site a simple video with images and actual video because, you know, we did have the ability to take video in the 1930s, even the early 1930s, that would document this colossal project. You would think that the completion of this dam would certainly be national news. We're told that it was. But would the people who were suffering the effects of the Great Depression, who were working the fields in California, since many of them came from the Midwest during the Dust Bowl, I'd even received a question in terms of how accurate I think the Dust Bowl was. Well, the Dust Bowl is probably what we're told it was, but the causes behind it are certainly up for debate. There's the great man himself, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pointing at the dam and being assisted by his aide because, as we know, he was confined to a wheelchair. But yet, through the good use of photography and video, a lot of people aren't even aware of that little historical fact. Is it a historical fact? I don't know. It's safe to say, though, that Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, and no one else has shared or will ever share that distinction in the United States. Here's the construction of the bypass bridge. Again, we're told that the whole reason that this occurred was for security purposes. We also have the wonderful account of all the individuals who came to work on this dam out in the middle of the desert, and I'm always intrigued by the fact that we have all these accounts of these wondrous engineering projects that just happen to really be out in the middle of nowhere. And everyone will tell you that the Mojave is the middle of nowhere. There's a reason why there's some of the largest United States military bases that just happen to be west of Las Vegas in the Mojave. And you'll have the major branches represented, minus the Coast Guard, of course, but who knows? There could be a Coast Guard station on Mono Lake way up there in California. I'll stop joking. The thing about the images, though, is we do get an idea of the colossal effort of construction that went into this. We also see some of the machinery that was available and the heavy machinery that was available. What I find intriguing about that is we consider the amazing buildings that we had built, name any state capital that was built in the 1800s, whichever one that we've looked at in the past, and you have to compare and contrast that with this construction of the dam. The other aspect of the Hoover Dam that I find interesting, oh, isn't this nice? All these dignitaries riding around here in this particular piece of construction. Yes, isn't it a fine time to be riding around looking at this marvelous dam? We do have some intriguing plans of the dam, although I have to say some of the schematics that we have seem to create more questions. There are some very fine details with it, and yet in other aspects there seem to be things that are hand-waved. And of course the reason we'll get for that again is security concerns. This is a major piece of infrastructure. This is critical to power supplies for the southwestern United States, and nobody debates that. And yet at the same time there's so many questionable accounts with this particular dam. And you can see that with the effort of construction that went into it, it would make a little bit of sense, especially in the 1930s, that if there was something out there that they decided to reclaim, perhaps that would be the time to do it. And indeed, it seems as though the 1930s really was a time of reclamation. So perhaps this Bureau of Reclamation could have been more active than we truly realized, in addition to all the other wondrous government programs that were going on during the 1930s, which we're told were essential for our survival. And if you were an individual who questioned these particular government programs, well, you tend to be ostracized in any manner of ways, whether you're a military officer or you were involved with a corporation, a politician, or in any way, shape, or form. It seems as though they did a very good job of creating a consensus in the 1930s, despite the economic hardships. Some of the other images that we have, though, show the cavernous construction and all the amount of material that was allegedly being moved. Of course, we can always say that many of these images, are we really sure that this is from the exact site that we're looking at? I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, how can we absolutely verify unless we were really there? The interesting images that we have, though, that show the fine-tuned construction of the dam itself always create more questions with how they actually poured the concrete. I would certainly love to see some more photographs that show the actual pouring of the concrete. We're told that was a very arduous process, and indeed that's where many of the individuals who unfortunately lost their lives in the construction or reclamation of this dam, where that happened. Now let's transition to look at some of the interior images, and remember we're told that this dam is Art Deco, although a lot of people aren't aware of that, and I certainly had no idea that the Hoover Dam was actually Art Deco. Yet you have these interesting, almost, dare I say, angelic figures that greet you when you arrive at the dam. We're told that there was some sculptor that was involved in this, but once again these seem to line up with what we think of as Art Deco. You also consider the numerous accounts of how this dam appears in many different video game franchises in the aforementioned Transformers franchise. It is a very well-known landmark. And yet, not many people are aware of the fact that on the inside you have some very intriguing symbols, which always seems to accompany anything that we see that's labeled as Art Deco construction. Yet, oddly enough, the symbols aren't traditionally what we think of as the classic American symbols. Just getting an idea, though, of the size and scope of these generators. And we also have to look at other dams, because we did come across the Keokuk power plant back in Iowa, which at the time was the largest dam. And here's an example of one of the initial symbols. Very odd. This is not exactly a symbol that we consider representative of the United States. You would think, this being the 1930s and everything being under such hardship with the Great Depression, we'd want to have some more recognizable American symbols. You know, the wings of liberty that never lose a feather. And instead we have this very interesting, I don't know, dare I say diamond or unique design. We also have these strange angelic figures. I mean, are these to represent the spirit of America persevering during the times of economic hardship with the Great Depression? Turn to the government, the New Deal will save you. I mean, is that what it's supposed to represent? Very odd, very strange, because these aren't symbols that we tend to see in other locations unless we're looking at Art Deco. The other interesting aspect about some of the symbols that you see, such as this one, is that while it seems to be on a very well built, is this a granite floor? Is this the concrete? Not sure. Is this some other advanced polymer? I don't know. You can't access a lot of these symbols because, as we said, a lot of portions of the dam are closed off. Just looking at some of the scale, though, of the interior construction, and once again, I know you're going to be surprised, we have virtually no images that show the interior construction. You just really don't need to see those, because if you have exterior photos, you can simply assume that everything went off on the inside. That seems to be a recurring theme that we have in these explorations. The other dizzying aspect with looking at the interior of the dam is you see some of the complexities. Now, some people may say that we have interior construction photos. Wait a minute. What is that? Is that the glaive there from Kroll with a big maze or labyrinth around it? And we can get some of the impressions of the Art Deco construction with unique symbols. And indeed, in other reliefs that you see across the dam, you'll see the usual array of symbols that don't tend to make a lot of sense, at least from our direct perspective. Look at that, the power individual there, flexing the muscles. And once again, we have another idealized human individual depicted here. They died to make the desert bloom. Well, maybe it should say, they died to make Southern California bloom. And I don't say that with any sort of disregard for the needs of the individuals in Southern California. It's just intriguing to me that we have this dam in Nevada, but it supplies power to all the Southwest. And again, I'm asking, why not just build more dams in the other states? They could have created more jobs, and then the dams could have paid for themselves by the power that they produced. But I don't know. It's just a question for me. You know, I'm not in government. I'm not a politician, and I'm certainly not representing any corporate interest. But look again at the elevator here, and we see this same Art Deco. And that's the aspect that you'll tend to miss if you don't really get on the inside of the dam. And it's challenging to look at the inside of the dam because of security concerns. We have these large caverns and passageways, and we also mix this with the symbols that we see that paint a different picture than what our initial impressions might be of the dam. For example, here we have a sprocket with a very intriguing symbol all around it. Now, of course, we have the usual artwork explanation behind this, and that was the very crux of Art Deco, or so we're told. There's also the aspect that a lot of these symbols are still in the dam, but you can't actually access it. You can only access it in one of the tourism-only areas. Very interesting. So is that really what's in the dam, or is that just what we're being shown that we're supposed to believe is there? Whatever the case, these symbols are very unique, and they seem to give a different account than what initial impressions would give of the dam. And if you ever get to travel to visit the Hoover Dam in person, and I recommend it even with the arid climate of southern Nevada and southern California, you'll find that you'll have many more questions. Even just looking at the exterior of the dam from any perspective, it creates many more questions. Because it goes back to the question of if we were capable of doing this during the greatest time of economic hardship in the United States history, why didn't we build more dams? In fact, why aren't we building more dams now? We're told that the United States economy has done exceptionally well despite the challenges of the early 2020s. And now that the United States economy has recovered and we're told that we have power shortfalls, we have infrastructure shortfalls, why don't we just simply build more dams? We could create more jobs. We could even put really cool symbols all over the dams and cause other questions. But for some unknown reason, we just don't do this. And there's a variety of explanations for why we don't. We don't have the political will to do it. We just don't desire to do it. We have too many safety standards, or we have other expenses that we have to attend to. I won't even say anything about the conflicts that we're supporting, whether it's materially or financially, or in all cases both, as it tends to be. But how was it that during the time of greatest economic hardship the United States has ever faced, it managed to complete, in a very short amount of time, an impressive work of infrastructure? An impressive work of infrastructure with wondrous and inspiring Art Deco decorations, maybe that's what Art Deco really is, Deco decorations, inside and outside of the Hoover Dam. What are your thoughts of the Hoover Dam? And by all means, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
We'll begin by looking at the estate timeline of the Biltmore. What was George Washington Vanderbilt's original vision for Biltmore? How did that vision evolve through the years? How does his legacy live on today? And our source here is from the Biltmore site itself. 1862, second year of the United States Civil War, George Washington Vanderbilt, what a name, is born on Staten Island. As a grandson of famed shipping entrepreneur and industrialist Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, George Vanderbilt takes his place among one of America's wealthiest and best-known families. And you might recall we came across Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, it's the Commodore, not the Admiral, when he ran afoul of William Walker, our famed filibuster who was from Tennessee, who attempted to assert American control, according to the official account, over Mexico and then furthermore Central America, until he was defeated by an intervening army from Costa Rica of all places. In any event, moving on, 1888, George Vanderbilt visits Asheville, North Carolina for the first time, and I'm quite certain he found it a very beautiful and alluring place, much as any of the rest of us did when we came across the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It captivated George Vanderbilt, and he considers the area as a location for his new country home. I mean, who wouldn't? Shortly after, he begins purchasing land for what will become Biltmore. He hires Richard Morris Hunt to design and build the home, and Frederick Law Olmsted to design the gardens and grounds. 1889, construction of Biltmore House begins. George Vanderbilt's 250-room French Renaissance chateau is a true marvel. Oh, so we're calling this a French Renaissance chateau, the largest undertaking in residential architecture in the nation, possibly the entire land. Over a 6-year period, an entire community of craftsmen, yes, those infinite numbers of craftsmen that we had available at the end of the 19th century, come together to create America's premier home and the remarkable gardens and grounds that surround it. Look at that picture right there. See, we've got scaffolding, so that's a very legitimate construction photo. I'm convinced. 1895, George Vanderbilt officially opens Biltmore to family and friends on Christmas Eve. Of course, what a great time. The country retreat George Vanderbilt has spent so long planning is marvelously decorated and full of festivity, because apparently that didn't take very long either. Infinite craftsmen and people who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and no safety standards. Not to mention no internet distractions. Anything could be done. Interesting image there. The finished home contains more than 4 acres of floor space, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, so more bathrooms than bedrooms, by 8, so you've got communal bathrooms too, and 65 fireplaces. Why not 165 fireplaces? 1898, George Vanderbilt marries Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. Edith is a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant, or Stuyvesant, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the first governor of Dutch colonial New York. After honeymooning in Italy, George and Edith returned to live at Biltmore. And by all means, please correct my pronunciation if it's off on this one. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt is born at Biltmore. George and Edith's only child is born on the evening of August 22nd in Louis 15 room in Biltmore House. Oh, so was there a Louis 1 through 14 room as well? I'm just being facetious, but why not? It is a celebrity birth, even by modern standards. Oh, isn't that intriguing? So did they put it out in the papers and broadcast it on the radio and then pushed it out on the internet since Nikola Tesla had invented the wireless internet by 1900? Oh well, no matter. 1900, construction of the main dairy and horse barn begins. You'd think they would have had that constructed right after the house. The horse barn is a thriving social and work center for the families who farm Biltmore and the agricultural heart of the estate. It remains a unique connection to the estate's past. 1914, George Vanderbilt passes away at the age of 51. Wasn't that old. George Vanderbilt is buried in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island. Why not build a new mausoleum on the Biltmore estate? I mean, you're out there in the mountains where it's very pretty. Why wouldn't you just build a new mausoleum? Well, I guess, the Vanderbilt family had to be in their mausoleum. He leaves a legacy of philanthropy, not oligarchy, which Edith continues, selling approximately 87,000 acres of the estate to the United States Forest Service for less than $5 an acre. Philanthropist, but, still less than $5 an acre. We're not giving it away for free. You don't give anything away for free. This includes the Cradle of Forestry as one of the first national forests east of the Mississippi River. Intriguing. 1924, Cornelia Vanderbilt marries the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil. 4 names. Maybe if he had 27 names, he'd be even more important. Look at that wedding photo. Quite intriguing. The Cecils are wed at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village, with Edith Vanderbilt escorting her daughter. What else have we got? 1925, George Vanderbilt's first grandson is born. Again, in the Louis XV room. Not one of the other ones. 1928, the Cecils welcome their second son. 1930, Cornelia and John Cecil open Biltmore House to the public. So, right at the start of the Great Depression, the Cecils respond to requests to increase area tourism during the Depression and to generate income to preserve the estate. All right. So it's the Depression. Who exactly has the money to engage in tourism? And who's actually going to be paying to go see the Biltmore House? Hey, dear, yeah, I know I just lost my job and I have no work prospects, but why don't we head on down to Asheville and go see the Biltmore? I know, we'll empty out the savings because our gold hasn't been seized yet, and I'll sell that, and then we can go to the Biltmore estate. Sounds like a grand old time. 1942, Biltmore House stores art during World War II. During the war, the house stores priceless works from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And why is that? Was there some kind of grand concern that the National Gallery of Art was going to be attacked or sabotaged in some way, shape, or form during World War II? At any point, was there any sort of existential threat to the United States? I mean, unless we're to believe that a U-boat was going to surface there in the Potomac and try to blast the National Gallery of Art with its deck gun. I don't think it'd have the range. Maybe the Japanese could have attacked with their little Zeppelins that they tried, if you ever read about that, riding on the wonderful jet streams. 1960, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil returns to Biltmore. Leaving his banking career in New York, William joins his brother George in managing the estate, focusing on self-sufficiency and preserving the estate's historic splendor. Isn't that funny? It kind of reads like the plot of the Dallas revival, the TV series in the early 2000 or the early 2010s. Where's JR when you need him? 1963, Biltmore is officially nominated as a National Historic Landmark. Really, that late? Why didn't they just instantly declare it a National Historic Landmark? You know, it's only one of the largest estates in the world, but, you know, we'll get around to it when we get around to it. The original landmark designation was based on the theme Conservation of Natural Resources. Isn't that rich? 1971, William Cecil plants his first grapevines just below Biltmore House and invited a guy by the name of Jean-Luc Picard to come work it. The inaugural wine vintage is bottled in the conservatory basement. Less than pleased with this first bottling, William Cecil travels to France, see, Jean-Luc Picard, and brings back sixth-generation winemaster, Philippe Jourdain, to be Biltmore's first winemaker. Oh, sorry, Jean-Luc. This goes on. 1983, the Biltmore Estate Wine Company is established. You know, because why not? We'll have a wine company here. Construction begins on a new state-of-the-art winery in what had been the estate's dairy barn. Mr. Cecil's son, William Bill A.V. Cecil Jr., assumes leadership of the renovation. Looks like he's having a grand old time there. Yeah, we're just doing a nice little renovation here. Hey, this is fun. I love every day. 1985, winery opens to the public. And he's named president and CEO of the Biltmore Company. Oh, so now it's a Biltmore Company. Over 100 years after his grandfather, George Vanderbilt, opened Biltmore House to family and friends, Mr. Cecil retires. His son assumes leadership of the company. Oh boy, is there really anything else to go on about this? Oh, then we have the Inn, which opened in 2001. So you can go stay there. And naturally, if you need the true certification that the Biltmore Estate is an old world building, remember, it is a popular wedding venue. Market Gardener's Cottage, 2005. Biltmore Estate opens to overnight guests. Why not? Antler Hill Village opens, so we've got our own little village there, a winery. Biltmore is honored for environmental stewardship in 2012, of course. And then the Village Hotel opens in 2015. And William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil passes away at the age of 89 in 2017. Looks like a comfortable picture. 2017, Diana Deanie Cecil Pickering is named chair of the board. She's the daughter of William Vanderbilt Amherst Cecil and sister to CEO and President Bill Cecil. So not the Vanderbilts, but the Cecils now, it would seem. Sharon Fenchak becomes head winemaker and vice president. Sounds like a fun job. So a lot of history with this Biltmore estate, and that brings us to today. So let's take a look at the floor plans. Now let's take a look at the floor plans that we have available from the Biltmore estate from our friend Richard Morris Hunt, another architect extraordinaire. We'll take a brief look at him, and yes, I'll be looking at the Wikipedia on him. But looking at the sub-basement isn't interesting. It's the sub-basement, as they call it, the lowest floor. We have the plant storage room. We have several boiler rooms, boiler and coal rooms, storage rooms. And one of the most notable aspects about the Biltmore is that it is a self-sufficient, quote-unquote, estate. It reminds us of many of the so-called asylums and vast hospital complexes that we've looked at in other explorations, where we see that they have the capability to be self-sufficient with their own power, and quite a layout. And indeed, when we look at some of the photos and the on-site footage, we'll see that there is some impressive construction that went into the foundation of this building. But we'll look at the construction photos in a moment. And in the basement, we have a kitchen in the courtyard, servants' dining room, servants' pantry, open to plant storage room below. Very intriguing. Numerous corridors, folding rooms, other corridors. Oh, and then there's a gymnasium and a lounging room, apparently. And this is where the great swimming pool is. That's an interesting thing to look at. And you've got your bowling alley, because, it just wouldn't be a place unless there was a bowling alley. The Halloween room. Is this the room where they practiced Halloween every day of the year, 365 days a year? Not really sure. Going up to the main floor, here we have the winter garden, the banquet hall, the billiard room, the breakfast room, the corridor, the balcony, music room. Very interesting. Butler's pantry. So many corridors, bachelor's wing hall, vestibule, and numerous vestibules, a carriage porch, an office. So many different rooms with so many stated purposes. Oh, here is the library, and then the den off the library. So you could go to the library, get a book, and then chill out in the den. Very intriguing. And breakfast room, and the music room. I think that's what all of our houses are missing, or our apartments. We all need a breakfast room and a music room. Let's go to the upper 3 floors. And we'll start with the second floor. And here we can see the top on the garden. Second floor living hall. There is the Louis XV room. Oh, I'm a little disappointed. I was expecting to see every other Louis room. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. That's the Louis XVI room. There's the Louis XV room. Interesting. So no Louis 1 through 14, but we do have a Louis 15 and a Louis 16 room. Yes, I know. When you look at enough Roman numerals, they all start to look at the same. Very intriguing numbering system, isn't it? We have the staircase hall. We have Old English. Chippendale. Yeah, that's what it's called. Sheraton? Do we have the Holiday Inn Express room as well? Very interesting with all these different rooms and all their naming conventions. Mr. Vanderbilt's chamber. Mrs. Vanderbilt's chamber. Mrs. Vanderbilt gets a little bit of an oval chamber, and Mr. Vanderbilt has a different shaped chamber. And the oak sitting room. So they each have their chambers, and then they could meet in the oak sitting room. Just so much space, you don't even know what to do with it. Chamber, chamber, chamber. Outside balcony. Open to banquet hall below. Yes, so much space and so many plans. Let's go to the third floor. Third floor living hall. Everybody has to have their own living hall. South Tower room. North Tower room. How come they don't have elaborate names? Oh well, doesn't matter. The Van Dyke room. Yeah, not going to go anywhere with that one. Watson room. The Madonna room. Was there some figure of the Madonna in the Madonna room? Very intriguing. All these named rooms, and we're only on the third floor. Chamber, chamber, numerous chambers, as in, we don't know what to call it room. We'll just call it the room of rooms, room 1, room 2. Just number it. We've run out of ideas. Fourth floor. Observatory. Servant, servant, servant. So all the servants got put up on the fourth floor. Very intriguing. But, they provided them an observatory and a nice little staircase. So what do you think of these plans? Would you like to have a structure laid out like this? And what other purposes do we think that this structure originally served in its original intention? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Now let's take a look at some of the collections that you'll find in the Biltmore estate. So let's take a look at some of the collection highlights of the Biltmore, and much like many other wondrous Gilded Age mansions or impressive compounds or complexes or whatever we want to call them, The Biltmore consists of more than 92,000 items, from architectural drawings of the house to works by Monet and more. A limited selection is highlighted below, including one of its oldest pieces and its newest addition. Italian Renaissance wellhead, circa 1500. Maker unknown. I'm surprised it's not referenced to some sort of Renaissance wonder. Location East Terrace of Biltmore House, and we can see that it's quite an impressive wellhead. Looks like we've got the old lion and some figures in it. Made of Rosa de Verona marble, this fountainhead was likely originally used to decorate and protect an active well in Venice during the Italian Renaissance. Likely. A likely story. It has become known as the Hunt Fountain, as it is depicted in the John Singer Sargent portrait of Biltmore House architect Richard Morris Hunt. Well, why not? I mean, he was the super architect who did it all. Triumph of Faith, circa 1530. Maker unknown. Belgian. So how could... Never mind, forget it. Tapestry Gallery of Biltmore House. Part of the triumph of the Seven Virtues series, this tapestry is centrally woven with the personification of faith as the female figure on the chariot holding a church, the cross, and a chalice. Above her are members of the Trinity. Very interesting. And is that indeed what it's showing, or is that what they're telling us it's showing? That's always the interesting thing when you associate dates and stories with items, but is that really what's associated with them? That's something that we always need to question. Chinese fishbowl, speaking of questioning things, circa 1573 to 1620. Very exact range there. Again, unknown maker, but it's Chinese. Library of the Biltmore House. Glazed porcelain fishbowl, decorated with the imperial five-claw dragon. There's the five claws. Is from the Wanli period of the Ming Dynasty. While there are 3 Chinese fish bowls in the Biltmore collection, this one is the smallest, the most colorful, and likely the rarest. What is that word again? We get a lot of likelies and probables. When did something become a something or a whatever, says Captain Picard. Very interesting. Ebony cabinet on stand, circa 1650. So, again, now we have a much more precise date. Maker, possibly Jean Mace or Pierre Gaulle? French. Location, oak sitting room of Biltmore House. This elaborate furnishing, and yes, it is very elaborate. Let's take a look at this without reading the description that we have on it. Looks like we got some nice vases on top of it. Very intricate patterns, though. And I always wonder on the origin of these particular items. Let's take a little closer look, because naturally we have limited access to these images. Very intriguing symbols that are depicted on this. And it's very intricate as well. Not sure exactly what to make of it. What are your thoughts on this ebony cabinet on stand, circa 1650, made by one of 2 French individuals? Oh, it also features a painting of Juno and Jupiter. The Chariot of Aurora, circa 1720. And here we actually have an individual identified, Giovanni Pellegrini, Italian. Library of the Biltmore House. So, wonderful works of art in that library. Richard Morris Hunt designed the library to accommodate the ceiling painting. I want a ceiling painting in there, Mr. Hunt. Please design the house to accommodate it, which George Vanderbilt purchased from dealer Joseph Spiridon under Hunt's advisement. Okay, wait a minute. So Hunt said, why don't you purchase this, and then you'll direct me to accommodate this painting that I told you to purchase. I'll tell you what, these stories become more convoluted. I mean, these official historical accounts become more convoluted the more you read them. Yes, I'm saying that. Originally located in the ballroom in Venice, in the Pisani Palace. 13 separate canvases and measures about 64 feet long by 32 feet wide. Now, here's the thing I always wondered in all these accounts that we have of this artwork from Europe that ended up in all these Gilded Age mansions across the United States. How was it the European nations just stood idly by and allowed this to happen? Oh, I know. Money. Money speaks everything, doesn't it? Now, do we really think that they would allow that to happen today? Let's just say we have some, we'll call him a philanthropist. An American philanthropist who wants to purchase all these wonderful European cultural artistic treasures. Are they really just going to stand by and let that happen? If the price is right? Never mind. Louis XV mantle clock, circa 1760. And here we have the makers designated and then some possiblies. And it's in Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedroom in Biltmore House. Oh, did Mrs. Vanderbilt have her own bedroom too? An intriguing account, isn't it? Kind of reads like the account that we have of the Hearst Castle over in California, one of many clocks in the Biltmore collection. Yes, that is quite an elaborately embellished piece. And it looks like we've got the 4 eyes for 4 there. The Louis XV style is characterized by curved shapes, a lightness or playfulness of design, and liberal use of gold, among other things. Very intriguing. What else do we have? Oh, the overmantle. Again, a 50-year period, circa 1700 to 1750, and an unknown maker. Swiss. Unknown, but we know it's Swiss. Tyrolean chimney room in Biltmore House. Serving as the focal point of the Tyrolean chimney room, this unique overmantle is an example of the incorporation of antique items into the design of the Biltmore House. So once again, we just have this vast amalgamation, this collection of all these very intricate and wondrous art pieces that all came from Europe, whether it was Switzerland, France, Italy, and again, no issues over in Europe because, the price is right. And look, it's George Vanderbilt. You just can't say no to him any more than you could say no to William Randolph Hearst in the 1920s. Look, they need artwork to adorn their places with. Very interesting. Netsuki? Unknown? Japanese? Are we sure? Quite an interesting little critter, isn't it? This is one of many Netsuki that George Vanderbilt collected during his 1892 trip to Japan. George Vanderbilt got around. Originally created as toggles to secure a storage bag to a kimono sash, Netsuki became highly treasured by Western collectors in the 19th century. Netsuki are exceptionally tactile objects and miniature sculptural masterworks. Yeah, I would say so. Is a mugwai a miniature sculptural masterwork? Never mind. Moving on. Ooh, I like this. Game table and chess set, circa 1820. Makers unknown. Biltmore Legacy. This Empire game table and its natural and red-stained ivory chess set were owned by Napoleon Bonaparte during his exile on St. Helena. Hey, did we get to see our good favorite actor there toying around with these things? Joaquin Phoenix, you're going to play with that chess set, but you're going to be thinking of Josephina, because that's what Napoleon did while he was playing chess. The movie showed it, and it was very clear. It's unclear how James McHenry acquired the table and chess set, but in 1883, he gifted them to George Vanderbilt for his 21st birthday. Oh, goodness. Hey, Josephine. Hey, Josephina. I'm thinking about you. Yes, I'm toying around with the name, okay? It's just very intriguing. The chess set that Napoleon had in his exile on St. Helena somehow ended up with George Vanderbilt. Is there any way to verify or, maybe do Pawn Stars in the 19th century? Okay, never mind. Roger and Angelique on Hippogriff, circa 1840 to 1900. Again, a vast array of time. And we're saying this is French. Location is in the Tapestry Gallery in the Biltmore House. Very interesting sculpture, though. Yes, I've never seen a horse with hooves like that, but yes, I know it's a mythological figure, or at least a representation of one. Really has you wondering what's going on here, and is there something else being depicted? That's what's always intriguing looking at these old works of art. Oh, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but yes, we have our old favorite symbol that's depicted on every single piece. Nothing odd about that. And I think we'll stop with this one here. The Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, a 30-year period, 1849 to 1879. Albrecht Dürer, German. So now we got the Germans involved here. Music Room of Biltmore House. This woodcut commissioned by Emperor Maximilian I to distribute as propaganda. Propaganda, what's that? Oh, I know. That's something that was done in the past by rulers and sovereigns of nations to have people think their particular way. We don't have propaganda in the 21st century. We have information, good information and bad information. It was created with 192 separate blocks. Though the original was made around 1515, this version was printed in the second half of the 19th century. And George Vanderbilt just happened to be an avid collector of the prints, and so naturally he procured it. Quite impressive, and very intricate as well. Someone should have a triumphal arch like this built. I'm kind of surprised that George Vanderbilt, or any one of the Vanderbilts for that matter, didn't have a triumphal arch like this built. I mean, they achieved the greatest triumphs just in building this. Oh, the desk set. Okay, I know I said I was going to stop, but I'll just look at this desk set here, because here we have another Louis XV style desk set, also known as the Encrier, is made of ormolu and tortoise shell. Very elaborate. I certainly agree with the description on that. And some very intriguing figures in this. So what do you think these selected pieces are showing us? And what does this tell us about the Vanderbilts? And why is it all of these individuals of importance, whether we call them robber barons, philanthropists, oligarchs, or just simply self-made individuals of tremendous esteem and ability from the 19th century? How did they happen to end up with all this art? And how could there be this much art to go around? And again, was the price just right and nobody in Europe wanted to resist all these upstart Americans acquiring all this? What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. So let's take a look at the construction photos that we have of the Biltmore estate. Very intriguing here. It looks like we have a makeshift railway that ran right up to the estate. Well, that's very sensible, and it certainly sorts out a number of logistical issues, and given how easily they could construct and throw up railroads anywhere that they wanted to, and apparently build locomotives because they had so many they were crashing them during that time frame, and then a couple years later. So we're informed that the Biltmore is constructed solely out of bricks and that lovely Indiana limestone, which there seemed to be an infinite amount of. And yet what appears to be limestone bricks, and again in the images here we have a lot of people standing around, although it looks like some people are working here, many cranes, and I'd like to know exactly how they excavated this out, because this is 1889, early 1890s, and whenever this photo was actually taken. How exactly did they dig all this out? Because they didn't really have heavy machinery available yet. You can see the cranes that they're supposedly using. And once again, these images seem to create more questions than they actually answer, and certainly we can question the veracity of them, but for the purposes of this exploration, we're going to take these images at face value, because it's even more interesting when we accept the account as it is, such as this picture we have of these individuals here by the construction with all their nice and fancy hats. And yes, these individuals don't look remotely ominous in any way, shape, or form. Just looks like a collection of well-meaning individuals, gentlemen primarily, who are just hanging out for the evening. He looks awfully familiar. Where have we seen that face before? I'm not exactly sure. Looking at some of these other images, though, we can see an elaborate complex that seems to have been constructed to complete the construction of the Biltmore estate. Now, what you would expect to see, especially in something that is very well documented, like I'll give this to the Eiffel Tower, at least they have images that are supposedly in chronological order. Although, things become a little bit more problematic when it comes down to trying to decipher the chronological order of the Biltmore estate images that we have of the construction. And again, we see a lot of the scaffolding and rudimentary cranes that were available. And I was kind of hoping to see a hamster wheel crane. Another image where we have individuals simply standing around and looking really cool as they do the construction. Well, we know why they had to stand around, it was so because of the limitations of the photographic technology and the cameras at the time. If they were moving, it would be very blurry, except for when they were doing the grand pass and review in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. So very interesting, and I would expect to see more images showing potentially all the brickwork, because like I said, what we're told is that the Biltmore estate, the inner walls are constructed of brick. Granted, this is what we're told. I don't know. I can't verify this because the place is already built, and these images aren't really answering this question, but brick surrounded by that ever omnipresent Indiana limestone, of which there seems to have been an infinite amount of, because this isn't the only structure that they use that wondrous Indiana limestone in. So, very impressive, and yet another conflicting account. And here we can see in this other construction photo, it looks like the structure is already completed, and they're either doing some renovation or remodeling. Now, I'm oftentimes lamenting the absence of interior construction photos, although it does seem to give us the indication that there is some interior construction photos, but again, look at this particular photo. What exactly is going on here? Now, we do actually see some brickwork, but there are many, how shall we say, unique questions that one could ask if they do additional analysis on this photo. Perhaps that's brickwork going on. Very intriguing background on this particular image, where we see some of the layout of the main structure and facade of the Biltmore house. But I think where we'll really find a lot of questions answered is when we actually do our on-site, because seeing something for real is always the best way to assess and analyze it. But looking at these images, we can see supposedly that this is some of the interior construction that was occurring. And oddly enough, it almost looks like we have bricks that are suspended in midair, or at least on top of the X-beams there. Hard to really say what's going on just looking at the images. And of course here we're supposed to be seeing the limestones that are all piled up and then construction of the structure on top of it. So many fascinating and conflicting images that we have that seem to portray many different questions that we would have concerning the construction of the Biltmore estate. And you might recall in our earlier exploration where we looked at the Biltmore estate, we saw that the family was with travel and acquiring all the wondrous artwork and the art collection that we just looked at, that they had to use to fill this very impressive edifice, this compound, this complex. And indeed, even to this day, we still have an entire village and everything else that's associated with it. So I don't know, it's very hard to tell exactly what to make of these images of the construction of the Biltmore estate. It seems to be very similar to other alleged images we have. So let's go on site to take a look at the Biltmore estate, and as we look around we can get an idea for this very impressive Indiana limestone, which again there seems to be no shortage of, especially at the end of the 19th century, to construct such an elaborate edifice. And we can see that there is no detail spared on the construction of the Biltmore, with some of the impressive images that we see in the decorations above each of the windows, which naturally won't become very clear in the construction photos. Sometimes when you're actually on site and you try to reconcile that with what you just saw in the old construction photos or some of the older photos, it almost becomes difficult to really believe that what you were actually looking at reflects what you're looking at now with your own eyes, because you can really verify what the structures are made of. And here we see many of the chimneys, and we can see the vast estate and how much space there really was on it. Of course, laid out by Frederick Olmsted, our good friend who achieved miracles for the Chicago World's Fair. Some of the details that you can see, though, within the particular Biltmore is that each of the balconies has decorative detail, and the towers do as well. And of course, there are the many chimneys. Now, I think it'd be fascinating if there were actually construction photos available of some of that. In the interior, though, you can see that it is very well decorated and adorned, and here we are in the billiards room, with many pictures in it, and we can get a good idea of just how well decorated this place actually is, and seeing this massive fireplace. Now again, this is some other construction photos that were lacking, was the construction of the fireplace and the interior. And again, I don't see that just a couple photos that hint at some of the interior features being completed, such as this column. And of course we never see construction photos of columns, and I can't imagine why. Nice organ. It's exactly what you need in your tremendous Vanderbilt mansion, is an organ. And of course you need every single doorway very well decorated and very well adorned to the top of every pillar. And every single bit of material that you can examine within this impressive edifice is real and genuine. And even this reminds me of some of the wonders that I've seen in the Midwest palaces or the state capitals, to include a very well decorated ceiling, because of course you need to have a very well decorated ceiling. Everything from the floors to the walls to the ceiling, once again, and it's no exception here in the Biltmore estate. And here we can see some of the elaborate pieces in the vast array of collections that we have. All the wondrous artwork and pieces from around the land, all consolidated in this one single location that just happens to be the largest house in the United States ever constructed. And here again you can get an idea for something that doesn't really hint of limestone, but almost seems like some sort of advanced concrete or geopolymer. And again, you can see the extent of the estate all the way out to the mountains. And there's no doubt that this is a very pretty land, and there are all kinds of areas here where you could expect someone to want to build their estate out in the middle of nowhere. But I suppose I'm just having difficulty reconciling the story of construction that we're given with what we're actually seeing in this on-site exploration. And once again, we have another one of the fireplaces that of course has columns around it. And again, infinite tapestries and decorations as far as the eye can see. And yes, of course, a very subtle bedroom that we would expect to see. Now, one of the things that I've seen many people ask about in the comments or express concern about is how exactly would someone, even with the wealth of the Vanderbilts, want to live in an edifice like this that would require this kind of cleaning? And that's certainly a great question. I'm also very intrigued by the fact that many of these very large edifices that we have, these mansions, these castles, these vast estates, whatever you want to call them, they have many odd similarities with some of the large asylums and hospitals that we've looked at across the land. And the similarity being that this is an entire compound that you could house many people. Well, the explanation here is that they needed to have servants' quarters, and of course, you needed to have a veritable army to keep this place clean and facilitated. And it's just because people who were very wealthy back at the start of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, had this to do with their wealth, and yet we still consider them philanthropists to this day. Look at this impressive staircase and some of the detail that you see with this. And this is just something that completely baffled me when I saw this in person, because you can see ornate details on the interior of this stairway. And now going down to the basement. And here again, this is not simple brickwork, but this gives you the impression of stones that have been arranged together in this impressive edifice. And certainly not that limestone, but stones that have been painstakingly placed together. Now, you do get the sign of bricks in some locations. But was this really constructed from 1889 to 1895 as we're told? Certainly somebody constructed it. Somebody put the effort to do this. But are we to really believe that it was this army of contractors and artisans who descended upon this isolated location, especially at the time frame, and even constructed this very wondrous pool? Now, what could the original intention have been for this pool? And look at how well arrayed this vault is, if you will, or this chamber that this pool's in. This doesn't exactly reflect what I'd expect of a pool, though. I'll say this for Hearst Castle, its pools seem like they were intended to be pools, but what was the original intention there? Again, looking at the exterior, you can see all the very impressive architecture and all the impressive detailing that went into finishing off the Biltmore estate. And you can see that calling this place a castle, a compound, yes, we have our lions again, is simply underselling it. And here's a still of the fireplace where you can see all the detail that went into it. Now, how much time would that have originally taken when they really did it? Now, supposedly, this is one of the most well-documented, as we love saying those words, constructed estates. And yet, even looking at this supposed documentation, we still have the same questions that we always have when we look at these elaborate construction photos. And I think that the Biltmore estate, when they're going to this kind of effort to show and tell us that, yes, this was an edifice that was constructed during what we consider the Fifth Era, or our contemporary civilization, you almost get the impression that they seem to be attempting a little much to try to give us that impression. Yes, we built a train out there. Yes, we had innovation in technology. It was the 19th century. Anything was possible. There were no logistical limitations. We can move the gauge on a rail track in 36 hours for 11,000 miles of track. So, naturally, building something like the Biltmore estate would be simple and easy. A little something I have for you to close out. Why don't you check and see how long it takes to build comparable modern estates, and see how it compares to the completion of the Biltmore estate. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but...
Your reputation precedes you, but you choose a bleak time to come to Cadia. Bleaker than you know. You are an abomination.
I prefer honored guest.
Warhammer 40,000, or also known as Warhammer 40K. a miniature war game produced by Games Workshop, our friends over in the United Kingdom out of Nottingham, of all places, the legendary location of the mythical, or real, hero Robin Hood. It's the most popular miniature war game in the world, and it's particularly popular in the United Kingdom. It's also particularly popular in the United States, especially in the 2000s, once a lot of the additions of additional fiction reached the United States. As in other miniature war games, players enact battles using miniature models of warriors and fighting vehicles. The playing area is a tabletop model of the battlefield, comprising models of buildings, hills, trees, and other terrain features. It's noted for its science fantasy setting in the distant future, where a stagnant human civilization is beset by hostile aliens and supernatural creatures. So naturally you can see these are the connections to the old world. This is why Warhammer 40,000 warrants our attention. And as we've looked in other intellectual and creative properties in the past on this channel, Warhammer 40,000 is no exception. We're going to take a look at its established lore. We're also going to look at a lot of the details that went into building this very impressive and amazing fictional setting, and question, is it really so fictional? Or is it actually inspired by events that may have happened not in the far future, but perhaps in the distant past, or maybe the not so distant past? And we're also going to look at where it connects to things that we've already looked at with other old world conclusions. Now, just to give you a little bit of an overview for how the game works, I believe they're on the 10th edition of the rules. That's been the latest edition. And the rulebooks and miniature models required to play Warhammer 40k are copyrighted from Games Workshop and its subsidiaries. These miniatures, in combination with other materials, dice, measuring tools, glue, paints, are generally more expensive than other tabletop games, and that should come as no surprise, as by far and away, Warhammer 40k is the most popular of tabletop games. The miniature models and the very aspect of assembling them itself is considered an artistic portion of the game, and really the hobby of assembling these miniature models is just as important as playing the game. The playing field is typically on a table of 44 inches, at least that's what's recommended, although it can vary based on the size of the armies, and in contrast to board games, Warhammer 40k does not have a fixed playing field. Players construct their own custom-made battlefield using modular terrain models. So once again, this is a game that allows you to use your own imagination, and it does reach into the elements of your own creativity and inspiration to have your own adventures. All the models that a player is selected to use in a match are collectively termed an army. And when we look at this, we think of this as just being a tabletop war game. But again, going past the gameplay, we look at the rich lore that has actually filled out the background of this entire universe, this entire intellectual property. And we're going to examine exactly what a psyker is. We're going to understand what the Imperium is. We're going to look at the tragic and unfortunate accounts of the Eldari, and of course the very insidious Necrons. A recurring theme within the Warhammer universe is the loss of humanity, or perhaps the loss of an organic species' actual existence. There's references to things like souls, and there's numerous examples such as the Adeptus Mechanicus, who decide to slice away their humanity and embrace more of an artificial existence. There's also the stagnancy of the Imperium of Man, or at least the great interstellar human empire that's in existence in this world, the technological stagnancy, and the societal stagnancy. We see so many examples and so many parallels to many of the things that we've explored in the past. There's also the tragic example of the Necrons, or the Necronal, as they originally were. An organic life form that was deceived into giving up their organic beings, and then being confined to an endless existence within an artificial body, sacrificing their souls in the process of biotransference. We compare and contrast the humans of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the technology priests, and how they decided to slice away their humanity as well. Now, when we examine this account of Warhammer 40k, I'm going to give it from my own perspective in the old world connections, and I'm well aware that there are many wondrous details of this particular universe, and I certainly invite the people that are more familiar with it to correct me in the comments or let me know if there's any perceptions that are incorrect based on the established lore of the game. I do have a respect for all lores, and I understand that I'm simply giving a perspective here of connecting to the old world. And we begin by looking at the Imperium of Man and the account of the god Emperor. The very setting for Warhammer 40,000 takes place in the year that we would think of as 40,000 AD, at least from the current year, or whatever dateline or chronological system we're using. The Imperium of Man represents the forces of humanity, under the God Emperor, or the Emperor of Mankind, although there's many different sobriquets for this particular individual. And it should be noted that Warhammer 40,000 does have many different inspirations from science fiction and history. For example, the primary symbol of the double-headed eagle. We've certainly seen it in our explorations before. And even looking at the account of who the Emperor of Mankind is himself, it oftentimes has many parallels with what we've looked at in very powerful past figures who may or may not have existed in our official history. And it should be noted that yes, this is set in a space setting as we have aliens, although when we look at the concept of the Psykers, a Psyker basically being a sorcerer figure from any of the species that can draw their power from the warp, although they'll typically say it's a being that has psychic abilities. And indeed, the Emperor of Humanity, or the Emperor of Mankind, actually had the most powerful Psyker capabilities within humanity. I'm always amazed, though, that they're able to depict these space regions on two-dimensional maps, but, it's a tabletop wargame, it only makes sense. The background and the lore, though, of the rise of humanity is quite intriguing. And indeed, we have accounts of the Astartes and the Space Marines and the augmentation of humanity. There is also the entire history of humanity, which we find many parallels with our old world explorations that we've done. The fact that there was once a time of high technology in humanity, when initially they were exploring many different realms. One of the elements or details of Warhammer that interests me, though, is the existence of the warp, a parallel dimension, if you will, where the Psykers draw their energy from. And this also again corresponds with many of the explorations that we've done with portals and tapping into other realms. So while you may see that Warhammer seems to be set within what we would think of as the classical existence of the space environment, it has many different dimensions to it, and many different layers behind its existence. And this is where I think we see many of the greatest of the old world connections. The other thing that we see is also tracking the rise and fall and even stagnancy of the so-called Imperium of Man. The Imperium of Man seems to be a fallen previous human civilization. It's still in existence, but it's locked in a path to where it cannot really advance. Many of its citizenry lives in a suppressive state, and perhaps we can all say this sounds very familiar. And when we talk about a suppressive state, what are we referring to? We're referring to the fact that many of the citizens of the Imperium are all dedicated to simply trying to maintain the Imperium. There's even the fact that this human government comes across different aliens and different threats, although once again, its greatest threats seem to come from the interior, or internal, with the corruption of the very forces that were set about to maintain it. We look at the account of the God Emperor of Man, or the Emperor of Humanity. Many different names for this individual. Indeed, he's also referred to as the Corpse Emperor by the forces of chaos, the gods that live in the warp that oppose humanity. And what's the real account of this individual? The God Emperor is a reincarnation of the shamans of humanity from the Neolithic era. And if you're going to be inspired by something, there's nothing better than to be inspired by the God Emperor of Frank Herbert and the Dune series, Leto II. In any event, when humanity rose to power and reached the dark age of technology, it was at its very ascendancy. However, following the dark age of technology, there was an age of strife, when humanity began to war amongst itself, when many of its wonderful creations of AI and its androids and cybernetic robots turned against it. There's really no record of it, and that's what makes the entire Warhammer 40k universe interesting. We're in an era of an empire that exists from this God Emperor, or this Emperor of Humanity, that is now stagnated. We can see that it has a very complicated bureaucracy and government that tends to match what we've seen before in our own historical accounts of what governments we had that came before, such as Rome and many others. Yet, looking at the account of the God Emperor, or the Emperor of Mankind, we can see that there are a lot of examples. And we recall that the Emperor of Mankind was considered the most powerful of Psykers, or those with psychic ability, in this universe, challenged by the gods of chaos, in the immaterium, as it's called, or the warp, where chaos exists. And this has been the challenge to all civilization. Humanity went through its age of technology, and then it fell during the age of strife, managing to achieve wondrous technological achievements. Does this all sound familiar for our studies and explorations of the old world? This seems to be a great parallel. And one of the things I respect about Warhammer 40k is that there's no limits on what in terms they integrate within their lore, such as the standard template construct. All the data stored in one area for all technology of all human colonies. This is considered one of the main technological components that was lost from the dark age of technology through the age of strife. And indeed, there are many elements within the within the human empire that seek to recover this. Much as we wonder if there's something that we seek to recover that could give us a record of our past, that has all the great records of building construction and technology that's been lost. Perhaps there are some that still have records of this. We even have accounts of the techno-barbarians that during the Age of Strife, when humanity was ripped to pieces, many different elements and factions fighting amongst one another. And indeed, what I also respect about Warhammer 40k is the fact that it's willing to integrate the fact that there may be a unreliable historical account. They oftentimes state that many humans are completely unaware of their own history, even within the last 10,000 years. It also acknowledges the fact that in the efforts to improve humanity, there were many mistakes that were made. Going back to the Emperor of Mankind, he simply started as a warlord who, during the Age of Strife, fought to unify first Old Earth, and then to re-establish the control and unified government of humanity. Once again, a theme that's reflected within our own history. He went so far as to augment certain human beings, the original Thunder Warriors that he created, to help him unify Earth and to re-establish the unified human government, although he found that these individuals he had created were unstable, and he attempted to destroy them, following on with an even more perfect plan for augmented humans. Now, this all sounds like a mishmash of various science fiction themes and ideas, and indeed it is, but it's very wonderfully written, and the way that the lore is actually shared within 40k gives it a coherence that we tend not to see. I find the Emperor of Mankind quite an interesting character for many reasons, and the unfortunate and tragic fate that befalls the Emperor of Humanity, the ultimate sacrifice, in order to try to maintain some semblance of civilization after tens of thousands of years of conflict. Indeed, it should be noted that after the Horus heresy, the God Emperor was mortally wounded by one of his primarchs, or one of the commanders that he had designed and prepared to lead his army, named Horus. He was confined to the Golden Throne, and thus, after being mortally wounded, this is why he's referred to as the Corpse Emperor, and indeed continues to exist with his decaying or desiccated body connected to the Golden Throne, maintaining stability and, of course, the Astronomicon within the warp. I find the Horus Heresy was where I found my way into the 40k universe, because it provided a background for the story of the Primarchs, and I certainly advise that you read it if you're interested, as it provides a lot of detail. And now let's move to the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Adeptus Mechanicus. The concept of technology within Warhammer 40k and within the Imperium of Man is quite intriguing, as it involves human beings, or techno-priests as they are known as, who are followers of the cult Mechanicus. Originally, according to the lore of Warhammer 40k, this faction was based on Mars, although we can certainly see that a faction of human beings that worship technology as something of divinity, starting anywhere. And perhaps the most intriguing element of these techno-priests is the fact that they have willingly decided to sacrifice their humanity, indeed replacing their own biological bodies with bionic components over time, amalgamating their minds with computers. And once again, it's an inspired science fiction concept, but it is a very well-used one, because it provides another entire dynamic and almost an entirely separate chain of command within the Imperium of Man. And what exactly is this cult Mechanicus that these techno-priests worship all about? It's about understanding technology. We realize that one of the great challenges within this particular setting is the fact that technology has totally stagnated. And this entire focus of these techno-priests is to try to find the original standard template construct, as having access to this knowledge will enable them to restore humanity and even exceed its previous height of technological capability. However, there's also a great belief within the Imperium that technology is evil, and therefore only certain individuals who have ascended to the right to search for technology may do so. Now let's compare and contrast that with what we've looked at with our own old world explorations. There does seem to be greater technologies that may be available to us, and yet we have numerous examples, both historical and both in our own alternative explorations, that show us that technology seems to either be oppressed or actively suppressed. Think of all the examples that we have of how far we could have come as a civilization if we had a more usable technology that actually applied to a greater segment of the population. Instead, we have numerous examples of technology being controlled, contained, and perhaps even obliterated from the actual historical concept. And this is where we see the real parallel with this whole Adeptus Mechanicus, this entire movement of these techno-priests who are actually searching for technology in the ostensible attempt to reuse it, but in actuality controlling it. And perhaps it may be true that while we don't have individuals who have stripped away their humanity by replacing their biological components with bionics or other elements of computers and machines, we do perhaps have some sort of force out there that does seem to control exactly what is released to the masses and what is retained for other uses. Within the Warhammer 40k, we find the highest technology within the Imperium of Man is actually possessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus. And what exactly are their aims and goals? Are they really commensurate with the goals of the Imperium of Man, or do they have their own agenda? Perhaps even more interesting is that some of the highest ranking members of the Adeptus Mechanicus do seem to have their own agendas. And yet when you read some of the more recently written lore of Warhammer 40k, you'll find examples of individuals who have their own agenda, which seems to actually be more of a heroic agenda. It's quite an intriguing dichotomy when we look at what may exist between the aims of individuals, and we also look at the other history of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They have not always been loyal to the Imperium of Humanity, or the Imperium of Man. And indeed, over time, they even took part in the Horus Heresy, with many actually supporting the attempt by Horus to support the gods of chaos and completely destroy the Imperium of Man. Once again, we have to ask, is this just simply a science fiction fantasy story, or are there a lot of elements within this that are actually from our true history? Because it seems as though there are many examples that we have within our own history that may have a lot more in common with Warhammer 40k than we like to admit. And once again, I know there's individuals out there that'll say that this is simply the product of imagination and fantasy, and that just because it's inspired by other science fiction stories doesn't mean that it's true. Yet there's something very compelling about it. And with all these details that we have, whether we're looking at the Imperium of Man or the Adeptus Mechanicus, that we simply can't ignore. And now let's go on and look at another example of something that may have happened in our past that becomes more alarming. The Eldari, or the Elder as they were long known to outsiders, are an ancient and highly advanced species of humanoid Xenos, although we could possibly think of them as yet another variety of human beings in our distant past. Their vast empire once extended the entire known existence, or as they say in the 40k universe, the galaxy. In its time, the Eldari Empire was without equal, spreading across both real space and the webway, as they called it. They counted themselves masters of the stars, and every Eldari was born a potent psyker, their abilities often used to both create and power their almost magical technology. So once again, potential references to civilizations in the past eras. And even death became no barrier, for when the Eldari spirits eventually left their mortal bodies, they dissolved peacefully, back into the Immaterium to be reborn again in new forms, for the warp did not thirst for Aldari souls then as it does today. And we can see this is another example of how other forms of existence can be corrupted. But according to the account in 40k lore, 10 millennia ago the Aldari's overweening pride and their fall into immoral and hedonistic practices led to a cataclysm that all but eradicated their kind and resulted in the birth of the chaos god Slaanesh, known as She Who Thirsts to the Aldari. Despite their boundless power, the heart of their civilization was torn out by this catastrophe of their own making, forcing many of the surviving Aldari to pursue different strategies for survival to protect their souls from being consumed by She Who Thirsts. So think of this account, this once great civilization that may be an analogy for a previous civilization in our own land that fell into hedonistic and immoral practices that eventually led to a total cataclysm, a cataclysm which even the physical reality of death they cannot escape. Do we not see examples of this in our explorations? And do we not see examples of this in our other explorations of other beliefs and other systems that may allude to what could happen if we don't keep ourselves disciplined, if we don't practice the most important element of self-discipline, which oddly enough it seems that many of the various themes of our current civilization want to detract us from practicing self-discipline. Are the Aldari or the Eldar a warning? And now we look into the account of chaos. Chaos, from the chaos gods, also called the dark gods or the ruinous powers. They're powerful, self-aware entities comprised solely of psychic energy who inhabit and control the psychic dimension that underlies all physical reality, known as the Immaterium or the warp. The chaos gods are in truth not really divine beings. Again, does this sound familiar? Though their great power often means there is little difference for those mortals who revere them. These warp entities are created and sustained by the emotions and collective desires of every sentient being of the material universe. When an emotion or belief in real space grows strong or widespread through the reality, it becomes embodied as one of the sentient denizens of the warp, much as we just recounted with the Aldari and their creation of the chaos god She Who Thirsts. The most powerful and most malevolent of these have become the gods of chaos. Although they are godlike beings, the dark gods are by their nature monomaniacal and completely single-minded, since they are formed entirely of a single emotion or concept. And perhaps the most interesting element of the chaos gods is that they are dependent upon the emotions of mortal creatures, especially the hordes of humanity, for their power and continued existence. Again, are we seeing an analogy for what the reality of our existence actually is? As a result, the chaos gods of the 40k lore strive to convert all mortals to their worship and service so that they may ultimately dominate the entire reality of existence. However, if they were to win such a dark victory, it would likely destroy all of reality, when the dimensional separation between reality and the Immaterium breaks down in its wake. Quite an interesting threat. Indeed, the near destruction of humanity came at the hands of chaos when they corrupted the Primarchs, and indeed the corruption of Horus, one of the greatest of the Primarchs, and his civil war against the Imperium of Man, nearly led to the utter destruction of the civilization, and it did lead to the physical death of the Emperor of Humanity. Consider this, the corruption of the great leaders, the corruption of these forces that tried to establish a more beneficial civilization. Once again, it's a theory, and it's something that we encounter in all of our belief systems across all of our societies. And here in this 40k lore, we have an actual and compelling account of how the greatest leaders of humanity were corrupted by the forces of chaos and turned against it. Indeed, the continued threat of the successor to Horus after he was killed by the Emperor of Mankind is Abaddon the Despoiler. Abaddon the Despoiler, who continues to manage to lead the forces of chaos, presenting a great threat to humanity. Oftentimes in the numerous Black Crusades, as they are called, that leads to the compilation and invasion of the great Imperium of Man, and it requires the sacrifice and the great effort of the leaders of humanity to try to prevent these invasions or these crusades from succeeding. Indeed, the most recent 13th Black Crusade, which led to the fall of Cadia, the human world or civilization, however you want to look at it, that exists near the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror being the opening within reality that was ripped when the Eldari fell into their corruption, creating this terrifying dark god of chaos. Perhaps there's a lot more to these details that we need to explore, as they do seem to reflect many elements that may exist within our reality. And indeed, we see that the great emperor of humanity, the God Emperor, nearly fell at the hands of his own corrupted leaders. Could this be a retelling of an account from the past? Is it possible that the great leaders of humanity's past also fell to this corruption? Indeed, could there be details of these stories in our previous civilizations that are still regaled by the mainstream? What's the reality of it? What are your thoughts? Is there something more to this account of the corruption of great leaders who tried to save a single unified civilization, and then ended up being the very ones who tore it apart? It seems to be a recurring theme that we have when we look at previous civilizations. And we also consider the very terrifying outcome if chaos were to win. It's a very simplistic way to define what may be the threat that's facing us. But we also have to look at the threat from within, the one that continues in other ways. Finally, the Necrons, the tragic backstory of a once great species of creatures that had a very tragic beginning. The Necrons exist as artificially intelligent robots in a way, although their background is quite intriguing, and we look at the very loss of souls when we consider the account of the Necrons. We might think of them as some sort of robotic creature that is possessed with some sort of entity or the remaining spirit. The origin of the Necrons is quite intriguing, as we think of the original race of the Necronal, as they were known as. They were unfortunately in lands that were bathed by radiation and suffered sickness and very difficult lives, and they're considered one of the ancient species of the 40K lore. They lived very unfortunate lives and very short lifespans. Indeed, much of their civilization was dedicated to the study of death. Could there have been a time in the past when human beings were in lands that were strifed with difficulties, that the very environment was destroyed to a point where human beings lived short and miserable lives? Or is it even possible that we're currently undergoing a phase of that when we look at the origins of the Necronter? However, despite this, the Necronter would suffer at the hands of ethereal entities, considered the oldest intelligence within the reality of the 40K lore, and that is the ethereal entities known as the Kurtan. These ethereal entities encountered the Necronal and offered them the terrifying experience of biotransference, where the Necrontal gave up their physical existence and even their very souls that were swallowed by the Kurtan. This was supposedly to give the Necronal the ability to have a physical immortality and live their lives in robotic bodies, or necrodermis as they called it, although the Kurtan had deceived the Necronal. And oddly enough, there's even some views that say that the Necronal were completely exterminated and obliterated as a people, and indeed that these robotic creatures are merely programmed with the knowledge that they are the remnants of beings that came in the past. Of course, this isn't actually from the 40K lore, it's part of the theories. And yet there is something about it with the Necronal and their biotransference into the Necrons that seems to lack some of those details. And indeed, 40K fans will debate this. The Necrons stayed in tombs for tens of thousands of years and finally returned to reimpose their will on the reality of the 40K universe. Is it possible that the terrifying fate of biotransference that the Necron underwent in their transference from the Necronal to the Necron reflects something that may have happened in our past? Indeed, when they talk about the fact that the Necronal lost their souls in their transference into these bodies of necrodermis, or simple robotic bodies, as we might think of them as. perhaps there is something that resonates with us today, with the fact that we do seem to have some people that we may come across that perhaps seem to be lacking something. Although, maybe this is just merely a perception in our minds, but perhaps this is the most terrifying fate that can befall any individual. Now, of course, the story of the Necronal is that the beings were dragged in chains to the biotransference machines to have their bodies destroyed and their souls fed on by these terrifying ethereal entities. Is that exactly what happened? Of course, the accounts of 40k lore say that the Necrons actually turned the tables on these ethereal entities that swallowed their souls and destroyed their physical bodies, imprisoning them. Although we have to wonder if that's actually what happened. And what I appreciate about the 40k lore is that it keeps these outcomes open. So what are your thoughts overall on the 40k world and this entire lore that's been associated with it? It's brought about by many different inspirations and creative inputs, and yet there's far too many connections to the old world to ignore. We haven't even begun to look at the technology that exists in the 40k universe, and there might be many examples. We've only done an initial exploration of the hive cities that exist. We haven't even talked about the great foundry cities that exist, and many of the other elements of technology, and the historical events that have occurred in this lore. What are your thoughts, though? What are your thoughts on these connections and how they relate to our old world explorations? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.